Hi everybody. Tonight I invite you to wander with me through the dim corridors of a forgotten past, a tale veiled in shadows, whispers, and secrets sealed beneath cathedral stones. Our journey shall unfold the silent chronicle of how the medieval church, guardian of both souls and fears, quietly smothered the embers of the witch hunts that once flared across Europe. You may find this story not one of blazing bonfires or shrieking mobs, but of silent parchments, hushed councils, and velvet-gloved hands steering the currents of belief. This is a story not of the flames, but of those who smothered them in silence. Let us begin, as all gentle tales should, with a slow unfolding of the world in which it all began. In the heart of the 12th century, the air across Europe was thick with incense and suspicion. The great Gothic cathedrals, with their spires stabbing at the heavens, stood not merely as houses of worship, but as fortresses of authority. These towering monoliths whispered sermons not just in words, but in the sheer gravity of their presence. Yet beneath their stained glass and solemn choirs pulsed an undercurrent of fear, a fear not merely of devils lurking in shadow, but of those accused of consorting with them. At first, the church did not formally recognize witchcraft as the peril it would later become. In those early days, the learned priests in their damp scriptoria would pore over the words of St. Augustine and early church fathers, who dismissed folk magic as ignorant superstition, a harmless folly of peasants. The idea that men or women could wield infernal power was treated as mere fable, unworthy of blood or fire. Yet out in the fields and hearth-lit villages, a different whisper wound its way between thatched roofs and forest edges. Here, stories thrived of women who mumbled strange words over herbs, of charms buried at crossroads, of silent figures seen beneath the pale moon, their shadows twisting in unnatural shapes. These were the tales that frightened the simple folk and bred the first sparks of suspicion. The church, though slow, was never blind. By the late 12th century, bishops began to hear these murmurs with sharpened ears. Not yet witch hunters, they were careful guardians of doctrine, more concerned with heresy than hexes. But in inquisitorial courts designed to root out the Cathars and other branded heretics, seeds were sown. Seeds of accusation, of confessions pried from trembling lips, of whispers carried into darkened chambers. But this is where our story begins to twist, as quietly as a shadow falling across a stone floor. Rather than fan the flames of panic, the church chose, at first, to conceal. The early records of alleged sorcery were not proclaimed from pulpits nor recorded in public chronicles. They were written in the margins of Inquisition records, hushed in correspondence between bishops, hidden within sermons preached only to the learned clergy. You see, open acknowledgement of such dark practices would risk unsettling the faithful, feeding a hysteria that could boil beyond control. It might even fracture the fragile authority the church wielded over restless lords and nervous peasants alike. So they covered it. They veiled the accounts of witchcraft beneath layers of theological debate. When rumours grew too loud to ignore, they framed them as isolated cases of sinful folly, not as evidence of an organised satanic threat. Documents detailing accusations were sealed within cathedral archives, their ink fading in silence, never to be read aloud. Bishops sent letters advising discretion, urging clergy to steer confessions away from fantastical claims and back toward known, manageable sins. And yet, like all things buried, the fear grew. As the 13th century dawned, more inquisitors began to encounter tales of witches during their hunts for heretics. The Cathar and Waldensian movements, with their defiance of church dogma, became entangled in whispers of dark rites and forbidden practices. The lines blurred in the shadows. Was a woman who brewed a potion an herbalist, or a servant of darkness? The church hesitated, fearing that public trials might stir a tempest they could not quell. It is here we meet the figures who would, in whispered corridors and behind cloistered walls, become the silent architects of a campaign not against witches, but against panic. Men like Bishop Eudes of Châteauroux, who in 1240 penned missives warning against the reckless spread of witchcraft accusations, reminding his clergy that superstition was the devil's tool, and that fueling fear could unravel communities. Or Inquisitor Bernard of Cour, whose meticulous records show a cautious avoidance of witchcraft charges, redirecting confessions toward orthodox heresies where punishment could be dispensed without unleashing chaos. Their words were not proclamations but veiled cautions, hidden between lines of ecclesiastical Latin aimed at a careful containment of fear. The Church in those days walked a blade's edge, balancing its role as spiritual shepherd against the threat of becoming the shepherd of a panicked, blood-hungry flock. Thus began the silent cover-up. In seminaries and cloisters, young priests were taught that belief in witches' powers was a dangerous superstition, not to be entertained. Parish priests were quietly instructed to quash rumours in their sermons, dismiss village accusations as folly, and discourage mob justice. Even the nascent Inquisition manuals reflected this tempered stance, cautious, restrained, veiling fear in layers of doctrine, and for a time it worked. Through quiet persuasion, hidden edicts, and the soft hand of whispered counsel, the Church stifled what might have become a wildfire of hysteria. It did not erase the belief in witchcraft, but it dulled the edge of panic, steering the faithful back into the fold of controlled faith and away from the abyss of mass fear. Yet beneath this careful silence, something darker stirred, a tension like a brewing storm behind calm clouds. The seeds of fear, though muffled, had been planted, and in the centuries to follow, when the tides of power shifted, those seeds would sprout in ways even the Church could not foresee or conceal. But that is a whisper for another night's telling. By the middle of the 13th century, the tapestry of Europe was stitched ever tighter with the threads of both faith and fear. The cathedrals stood taller, the monasteries grew richer, and the influence of the Church reached farther than any king's command. Yet beneath this outward harmony, a quiet vigilance stirred among the clergy, a watchfulness bred not from open warfare with witches, but from the dread of losing control over the hearts and fears of the people. In the silent chambers of monastic scriptoria, the ink of cautious men flowed like a slow river. Manuscripts spoke not of fiery persecutions, but of moderation, of prudence in the face of the strange and the unexplained. The words of St. Augustine echoed again and again. Magic, if it existed at all, was but a deceit of the devil, a powerless illusion meant to snare the foolish. Priests were taught that belief in witches gave the devil more power than truth allowed, and that such beliefs must be gently but firmly corrected. And yet, in the quiet places beyond cathedral towns, along the dark edges of forests, in hamlets where priests came but seldom, the whispers never ceased. There, the old fears wore many masks. A cow's sudden death, a child's lingering fever, a failed harvest, all were seeds for suspicion. It was not that the people hated the Church or distrusted the priests. Rather, they dwelled in a world alive with mystery, where unseen hands seemed to tug at the threads of daily life. The priests' Latin prayers offered protection, but the old woman who knew the herbs, she offered something nearer, something tangible. And so suspicion of witches grew, not by the hand of the Church, but by the restless murmur of the common folk. The Church watched this with wary eyes. It was in this climate that a subtle form of control emerged, a quiet strategy born of necessity. Bishops and abbots began sending letters to parish priests, gentle in tone, but firm in message. When rumours of witchcraft arose, the priests were to intervene with calm words and sober counsel. They were to remind the people of God's sovereignty over all things, and to steer them away from fear's wild edge. Behind closed doors, councils of learned men debated whether it was better to openly denounce these rumours or allow them to fade into obscurity. The fear was simple and sharp. Should the Church itself take up arms against witchcraft, it risked giving those fears legitimacy. To denounce it too loudly would be to admit its power. To prosecute it openly might give rise to the very panic they feared. So they chose a third path, the path of silence and quiet deflection. Monasteries began compiling lists of superstitious practices forbidden to the faithful. These lists were read during confessions, not as fiery warnings, but as mild corrections. To make a charm, to believe in love potions, to fear a neighbour's curse, these were called sins of ignorance, not crimes of diabolism. The penances were light, the tone gentle. It was as if the Church sought to drain the poison slowly, with soft words and patient hands. And this approach for a time proved effective. In inquisitorial courts, the rare cases mentioning witches were often brushed aside in favour of more pressing concerns. heresy, blasphemy, apostasy. When a villager spoke of a neighbour's curse, the inquisitor would often redirect the confession towards sins of the tongue, gossip, false accusation, slander. The witch herself, if accused, was often warned, perhaps given a mild penance, but seldom punished severely. Better, the Church reasoned, to keep the matter quiet than to fan the flames of fear. Yet the whisper of witches was a weed that refused to wither. Throughout the scattered towns of France, Germany, and the Low Countries, strange cases arose, isolated yet troubling. In the village of Coucy, a miller swore that his cattle fell dead after a widow's glance. In the valleys of Swabia, women were accused of dancing with shadows at midnight. In the Breton countryside, a healer was blamed for a nobleman's wasting sickness. The Church moved quietly, sending trusted priests to investigate, not to punish, but to contain. Always to contain. And still, the fear bled into the bones of the people. A curious thing happened in this quiet war of words and whispers. The more the Church sought to dampen the talk of witchcraft, the more determined some became to believe in it. Among the laity, stories grew more elaborate, embroidered with every telling. Witches were said to fly on storms, to poison wells, to summon spectres in the dead of night. These tales travelled faster than sermons and rooted deeper than doctrine. The Church began to understand a bitter truth. Fear could not be silenced by decree alone. In Rome, within the hallowed halls of the Lateran, the learned men of the Curia debated new measures. Should the Church take a firmer hand? Should it begin to prosecute openly, to reclaim the narrative before it slipped away? Yet again and again, the decision returned to caution. Fear was a beast that, once roused, could not easily be tamed. Better, they thought, to keep the beast asleep. Thus arose the delicate dance, a dance of silent containment. Priests were urged to preach of God's mercy more than his wrath. Inquisitors were counselled to seek repentance rather than punishment. Monastic scholars wrote treatises reminding the faithful that Satan's power was always subject to God's will, that witches, if they existed at all, could not stand against true faith. And quietly these teachings slipped into sermons, into confessions, into the soft rhythms of daily prayer. Yet beneath this fragile calm, the ground shifted. In some corners of Europe, zealous priests broke ranks, driven by personal fervour or local panic. They stirred their flocks with fiery sermons against the devil's servants, speaking words the Church in Rome would never sanction. And with every such outbreak, the Church hurried to mend the rift, to silence, to correct, to soothe. For the high clergy, the witch hunts were a fire that must never be allowed to blaze. Their fear was not only for the souls of the accused, but for the soul of Christendom itself. If the people's faith became entangled with bloodlust and hysteria, the delicate order of the world, the sacred balance between church and flock, might unravel. And so they laboured on in silence and in shadow, threading the needle between faith and fear. But shadows, as all know, have a way of growing when left unchecked. By the turn of the 14th century, Europe drifted ever deeper into an age of unease. Famine gnawed at the edges of once thriving lands, the harvests often thin, the winters bitter. A pall hung over the countryside, a slow, creeping dread that had no single face but pressed against the hearts of peasants and nobles alike. In this world of uncertainty, the whisper of witches did not fade. It sank deeper, like water seeping into the roots of a tree. The Church, perched atop its ancient cathedrals and behind the veils of its solemn councils, remained vigilant in its silent campaign. The high clergy understood well how easily fear could tip into frenzy. They remembered, as all careful men do, the lessons of past panics, how a single spark could ignite a village into madness, how accusation could turn neighbour against neighbour. So they moved, always with caution, always with quiet resolve. Behind the carved wooden doors of monastic chapter houses, bishops issued letters that spoke softly of charity, of peace, of the need to guard against idle tales. The language was never sharp. Rather, it flowed with the calm assurance of those who believed in the slow power of reason over the quick fury of rumour. They counselled that accusations of witchcraft were to be treated as symptoms of ignorance, not signs of real danger. In many parishes, this guidance took root. Priests became quiet sentinels, moving through their flocks with words of calm, redirecting suspicion toward forgiveness rather than fear. When a woman was accused of casting a shadow over a harvest, the priest might visit her home, pray with her, and gently counsel her neighbours against idle gossip. The penance given was often symbolic, a few prayers, a day of fasting, not the lash or the fire. But outside the quiet reach of the church's measured hand, the world churned. In the markets of Flanders, in the taverns of Lombardy, in the crowded streets of Paris, and the silent hamlets of Saxony, stories of witches began to take on new colours. They grew darker, sharper, more venomous. What had once been tales of old women muttering over herbs became rumours of midnight pacts with the devil himself. The devil, a figure whom the church had long painted as the defeated enemy of Christ, began in the minds of the common folk to seem more present, more terrifying. And still, the church held its course. It was in this time that certain writings meant to quell hysteria took on an unintended life of their own. Learned men, seeking to explain away fears, wrote treatises against superstition. Treatises that described, often in vivid detail, the very acts they sought to deny. One such was penned by a Dominican friar who sought to explain that witches held no real power. Yet in doing so, he catalogued all the fears of the age, flying on broomsticks, consorting with demons, cursing crops. His words, intended as rebuke, became fuel for the imagination of a restless populace. The church noticed and acted. Quietly, such writings were recalled from circulation, tucked away in monastery libraries where only the most scholarly eyes would see them. Bishops issued subtle warnings to their clergy: speak not in sermons of the devil's power beyond what the gospel declares. Emphasize God's mercy. Discourage wild tales. Keep the peace. Yet fear, once planted, has a way of growing in the cracks of human hearts. In the regions where famine struck hardest, where plague began its whispered approach from the east, the fragile veil between belief and panic began to thin. A sick child, a barren field, a storm that wrecked a harvest, these became signs not of nature's cruelty, but of some malevolent force at work. The people looked for answers, and often they looked to the old woman living at the edge of the village, the healer who spoke to herbs, the widow who kept to herself. The church, with all its measured warnings and cautious counsels, could not reach every corner of every land. In the absence of its calming voice, suspicion grew unchecked. Some parish priests, younger and less tempered by Rome's cautious hand, began to preach sermons laced with warnings of Satan's minions walking among the faithful. They spoke with zeal, with the fiery passion of those who believed they fought an unseen war. And when such sermons kindled a mob, when an accused woman was dragged from her home, the bishops moved quickly, but not always quickly enough. In many such cases, the church's response was swift but quiet. Priests who stirred panic were summoned to private councils, rebuked in gentle but firm words. Monasteries issued letters urging restraint. In some cases, bishops travelled in person to troubled towns, offering public sermons on God's justice and mercy, subtly redirecting the people's fears. Yet there were times when the damage was already done. An accused woman hanged in a village square, a healer drowned by a panicked crowd, a family driven from their home by whispers that they harboured dark powers. These incidents were rare but deeply unsettling, each one a tiny crack in the church's careful wall of silence. In Rome, the great councils whispered of these events with growing concern. They spoke not as men indifferent to suffering, but as guardians of a fragile order. They knew that if the fear of witches became a tide, it could sweep away the authority of the church itself. The mob does not distinguish between priest and peasant when gripped by hysteria. The careful architecture of faith, law and power could crumble beneath the weight of uncontrolled fear. And so, the silent campaign continued. New edicts were drafted, couched in the language of pastoral care. Bishops were given quiet authority to intervene directly in cases of witchcraft accusations, not to punish but to protect. They could nullify local judgments, grant sanctuary, even move accused persons to safer places under church protection. These powers were used sparingly, often in the quiet hours of the night when the eyes of the world did not see. The church became, in its way, a secret guardian against the flames it feared. But even as they worked in silence, the shadows lengthened, for there were places where the church's soft hand was not enough. Regions where secular lords, eager to assert their power or curry favour with the mob, took up the cause of rooting out witches themselves, and where the church could counsel and contain, these lords could not, or would not. In those lands, the silent cover-up began to strain under the weight of something darker. As the 14th century deepened, the landscape of Christendom darkened beneath twin shadows, the gnawing spectre of plague and the silent march of war. The Black Death, with its silent invisible hand, swept across Europe like a creeping tide of sorrow. From the bustling cities of Italy to the quiet hamlets of England, the pestilence spared neither king nor pauper. Entire villages vanished into silence, fields lay fallow, churches echoed with the hollow tolling of funeral bells. In the face of such vast suffering, the minds of men turned ever inward, searching for reasons in a world that seemed to have none. Why would God allow such horror? Why would the heavens, so often invoked by the church, remain mute in the face of this dark tide? The answers did not come in the form of scripture, nor in the calm sermons of weary priests. They came in whispers, soft at first, then sharper, of unseen hands guiding the plague, of shadowed figures casting curses upon the land. Witches, once merely a hushed suspicion in village lore, now became convenient bearers of blame. And still the church clung to its quiet policy. Within the high walls of monasteries untouched by the first wave of pestilence, abbots and bishops gathered in council. They spoke in hushed Latin, their voices low but resolute. This was a time for pastoral care. They reminded one another, not for fanning the embers of hysteria. The church's role was to guide the faithful toward hope, not to drive them toward fear. And yet even the church was not immune to fear's subtle sting. In Avignon, where the papal court had settled, learned men debated behind closed doors. Should the church alter its stance? Should it meet the rising tide of superstition with a firmer hand, perhaps even embrace the role of witch hunter, if only to control it from within? Voices rose in quiet conflict. Some argued that to deny the fears of the people was to invite rebellion. Others warned that to feed those fears was to surrender to darkness. But it was Pope Clement VI who spoke with the soft authority that settled the matter for a time. "We are shepherds," he reminded his cardinals, "not wolves. If we chase shadows, we may forget the light." So the church remained upon its narrow path, a path of quiet suppression and unseen intervention. Priests continued their silent work among the people, quelling rumors where they could, redirecting suspicion toward God's mercy rather than man's fear. Bishops traveled in secret to villages on the brink of hysteria, offering coins for the poor, prayers for the sick, and private counsel for the accused. Inquisition courts, where they still operated, treaded lightly upon cases of witchcraft, dismissing most as matters of ignorance and folly. But beyond the church's reach, the world seethed. Secular lords, their power shaken by plague and rebellion, began to wield accusations of witchcraft as a tool of control. In small fiefdoms, barons and counts took it upon themselves to root out supposed conspiracies of witches, often as a means to assert authority or settle debts of suspicion. The church frowned upon such acts, but its rebukes, soft, veiled in pastoral language, often arrived too late. In Germany, where the land splintered beneath the weight of fractured principalities, the first embers of organized witch trials began to glow. Local courts, emboldened by fear and unchecked by ecclesiastical restraint, conducted trials that bore little resemblance to the cautious inquisitions of the church. Torture, confession, execution, all carried out with a brutal efficiency that horrified the more learned clerics. Yet here lay the church's silent dilemma. To speak out against these trials was to risk appearing as a protector of witches, a stance that could unravel its authority among a frightened populace. But to endorse them openly would be to surrender its moral compass to the madness of the mob. And so the church remained fixed upon its silent policy of containment and careful correction. In cloistered scriptoriums, monks began compiling new collections of sermons and pastoral letters, carefully crafted to steer the narrative. These texts spoke of the dangers of superstition, the folly of mob justice, and the boundless mercy of Christ. They were sent quietly to parish priests across Europe, slipped into the routine sermons of ordinary Sundays, woven into the fabric of pastoral care. Yet even as these words spread, so too did the tales of witches. In the shadows of the Alps, rumours whispered of covens gathering beneath the moon. In the dark forests of the Rhineland, peasants spoke of women riding the wind, calling storms, poisoning wells. The fears that the church had long sought to soothe now echoed louder, stronger, fed by famine, plague, and the simple, terrible need of people to find a cause for their suffering. The church responded in the only way it knew, with quiet vigilance. Cardinals sent private envoys to regions where hysteria flared. They counselled restraint, reminded local priests of the dangers of unbridled fear. In some cases, they intervened to protect the accused, offering sanctuary within monastery walls or removing them quietly to safer lands. They spoke softly, moved gently, always wary of tipping the fragile balance between authority and unrest. But they knew, in their hearts, that a tide was rising. A tide born not of doctrine, nor of heresy, nor even of organized belief, but of raw human fear. The church could hold back that tide with quiet words and careful hands for a time. But how long could a wall of silence withstand a flood of terror? In the quiet hours of the night, within the high stone walls of abbeys and the echoing chambers of cathedrals, men of faith pondered this question with growing unease. For they knew that when fear outpaces reason, even the mightiest hand may struggle to contain the storm. As the 14th century waned and the 15th began its slow unfolding, the church found itself walking a path more precarious than ever before. Europe lay fractured by pestilence, war, and the silent erosion of certainty. Where once the bells of the church had rung as symbols of unchallenged authority, now their echoes carried a different sound, a faint but growing tremor of unrest, of doubt, of fear pressing against the very heart of Christendom. The plague, though it receded and surged in waves, had forever changed the landscape of faith. The faithful, who once turned with unquestioning devotion toward the altar, now carried quiet questions in their hearts. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why had the prayers of priests not stemmed the black tide? And in that space where certainty once stood, fear took root. A fear that needed faces, names, causes. Witches became those faces. The church, ever vigilant, recognized this shift with a sense of quiet alarm. It was not the theology of witchcraft that troubled them most. After all, the church's stance remained firm and well grounded in centuries of doctrine. Witches, they taught, held no real power save that which God permitted. Superstition was a snare for the foolish, not a threat to the faithful. No, what truly stirred unease in the Vatican's marble halls and in the cold cloisters of distant abbeys was something far subtler. The fear of the mob. It was the mob, unthinking, seething, unchained, that posed the greatest danger to the delicate balance of church authority. The church's power rested not merely in sword or scripture, but in the consent of the governed, the shared belief in its moral and spiritual supremacy. If fear of witches were to run wild, if mobs turned to lynchings and false accusations without clerical control, the entire edifice of order might crack. And so, the cover-up became both quieter and more determined. In dioceses across Europe, bishops received carefully worded letters from Rome. These were not proclamations for public reading, but private instructions intended for clerical eyes alone. They warned against allowing accusations of witchcraft to reach civil courts without ecclesiastical oversight. They urged bishops to personally intervene when rumours threatened to spark unrest. Above all, they counselled discretion, containment rather than confrontation. In the villages, this took many forms. Parish priests began to employ subtle tactics, speaking not of witches directly, but of the dangers of idle tongues, of the sin of slander, of the Christian duty to guard against rumour. They reminded their flocks that judgment belonged to God, not to angry neighbours. Confessions that touched upon witchcraft were steered gently toward repentance for fear or gossip, not punished or made public. When whispers grew loud, local clergy often acted in quiet haste. The accused might be brought before the church, not for trial but for quiet counsel. In many cases, these interventions saved lives. An accused healer might be instructed to confess a lesser sin and given sanctuary in a convent. A suspected witch might be quietly relocated, given work within a monastery's walls under the watchful eye of the abbot. These were acts of mercy veiled beneath caution, meant as much to protect the community from hysteria as to shield the accused from harm. Yet even as the church worked tirelessly to dampen the embers of fear, forces beyond its reach began to stir. In the German principalities, where the fractured authority of the Holy Roman Empire left vast regions under the sway of petty lords and ambitious magistrates, local trials began to take on a new, more brutal character. Civil authorities, untethered from Rome's cautious hand, began to wield witchcraft accusations as tools of control, vengeance, or even political gain. In places like Würzburg and Bamberg, the first of what would later become infamous trials flickered to life. These were not the inquisitions the Church feared might spiral out of control. These were civil trials, often led by secular judges, where the accused were tortured until they confessed to impossible crimes. The Church watched these developments with a mounting dread, for it knew that the more the secular powers seized upon witchcraft for their own ends, the harder it would become to maintain its silent grip on the narrative. Rome responded in the only way it could, by tightening its silent hold over its own clergy. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a bull known as Summis Desiderantes Affectibus. Though often misrepresented in later centuries, this papal edict did not call for a general witch hunt across Christendom. Rather, it sought to bring wayward inquisitors under papal control, granting them authority to investigate claims of witchcraft, but binding them within the careful oversight of church law. It was a document meant less to fan the flames than to prevent them from spreading uncontrolled. But the world heard what it wished to hear. The bull, though cautious in its language, gave a veneer of papal approval to those eager for blood. Inquisitors like Heinrich Kramer took its words and twisted them to suit their zeal, writing treatises such as the Malleus Maleficarum, a dark manual that would, in time, become synonymous with the very witch hunts the Church sought to prevent. Though Rome itself disapproved of such works, though bishops quietly distanced themselves from Kramer's fiery rhetoric, the damage was done. The silent cover-up faltered. No longer could the Church rely solely on soft words and quiet interventions. The fears it had worked so hard to contain now had voices, faces, and printed pages. The mob did not read papal bulls in their nuanced Latin. They heard only the echoes of sermons, the rumours of trials, the whispered confessions extracted beneath the rack. The Church found itself in a cruel bind. To denounce the growing hunts openly might weaken its hold upon a frightened populace. To embrace them would betray its most sacred teachings. And so the Church doubled down upon its old strategy, working in silence, behind closed doors, through quiet diplomacy and unseen acts of mercy. Bishops travelled in secret to intervene in trials gone awry. Monastic orders quietly sheltered the accused, whisking them away before civil authorities could act. Priests delivered sermons designed to calm rather than condemn. And in Rome, cardinals debated endlessly how to reclaim the narrative without feeding the fire. But the fire, once kindled, is a hard thing to smother. In the quiet hours of the night, within abbeys where candlelight flickered against ancient stone, men of faith sat with quills in hand, writing letters that carried both hope and dread. They knew that a storm was gathering, one that words alone might not stop. And in the silent spaces between those carefully chosen words, a darker fear took root, that perhaps this time silence would not be enough. As the dawn of the 16th century broke across Europe, the great tapestry of Christendom lay stretched and fraying at its edges. The world was changing, not in great, thunderous revolutions, but in slow, persistent shifts that pressed against the bones of the old order like the steady rising of a tide. Trade flowed more freely, kingdoms grew bolder, and among the quiet folk of the land, fear wound itself tighter around hearts already worn thin by war, plague, and famine. And in the shadow of these slow upheavals, the murmur of witches grew louder. The Church, still holding its posture of silent watchfulness, found itself in a world that was no longer so easily guided by whispered sermons and quiet interventions. The printing press, that new and unsettling invention, spread words faster than any priest could hope to counter. Pamphlets, lurid tales, and exaggerated reports of witchcraft trials began to drift from town to town, carried not by the hushed hand of rumour, but by ink and paper. The Church recognized this danger with a chilling clarity. What had once been a matter of local whispers, the accusation of a village healer, a suspicion about a reclusive widow, was now transformed into a spectacle that travelled on the wings of the written word. accounts of witches making pacts with the devil, of secret gatherings in forests, of curses cast upon noble houses. These stories, once the stuff of fireside tales, now appeared in printed form, read aloud in taverns, marketplaces, and even within the shadows of church porches. Rome, ever cautious, reacted not with proclamations, but with quieter tools. Papal legates were dispatched under the guise of pastoral missions, instructed to temper the spread of these tales where they could. Monasteries took on the role of unofficial censors, purchasing and quietly removing from circulation those texts deemed dangerous to the fragile order of faith and reason. Bishops convened councils, not grand synods, but subtle gatherings of local clergy to reinforce the message of calm and containment. And yet the Church's hand, though deft, could not reach every corner. In lands fractured by political rivalry, the Swiss cantons, the scattered German principalities, the independent city-states of Italy, secular courts embraced witch trials as instruments of both control and profit. Torture chambers filled with the cries of the accused, their confessions twisted and stretched into grand conspiracies that fed the hunger of the fearful and the ambitions of the powerful. The Church watched this unfold with a deepening sense of dread. For in those trials, they saw the reflection of their greatest fear, that the authority of Christendom could be swept away in a tide of blood and fire, driven not by heresy or rebellion, but by unbridled panic. The silent campaign to contain the belief in witchcraft had begun to crumble, not because the Church wavered, but because the world itself had changed. Among the clergy, a quiet despair settled in some hearts. They wrote of it in letters exchanged between monasteries, their words heavy with a weariness that no council or bull could ease. The people, one abbot wrote, no longer heed the gentle hand. They chase after phantoms, and in chasing them, they risk becoming the very thing they fear. The higher orders of the Church responded with renewed efforts at subtle containment. The Jesuits, a newly rising order famed for their discipline and learning, took upon themselves a silent role in this battle, entering universities, courts, and councils, steering the conversation away from fear and toward reason. They debated scholars, counselled rulers, and worked quietly within the folds of power to stem the tide of hysteria. But even their efforts met with only mixed success. For every town where a Jesuit calmed the fears of a nervous council, there was another where a secular judge, eager for influence or coin, pressed forward with a witch trial unblessed by ecclesiastical oversight. The Church's refusal to publicly embrace the witch hunts was both its shield and its chain, protecting its doctrine, yet limiting its influence in an increasingly fragmented world. And then came the Reformation. The split that tore Christendom in two struck like a silent thunderclap, reverberating through every cathedral, monastery, and humble chapel. Martin Luther's words, though aimed at indulgences and clerical corruption, opened a floodgate the Church had long feared, a questioning of authority itself. In this new, uncertain world, accusations of witchcraft took on yet another face. Among Protestants, the witch became a symbol of Catholic corruption, a scapegoat for the sins of Rome. Among Catholics, witches were sometimes painted as allies of heretics, enemies of the true faith. The line between religious conflict and fear of the supernatural blurred until they became one thread woven of both terror and suspicion. The Church, already weakened by internal fractures and external assault, tightened its policy of silent resistance. No great council was convened to address the witch hunts. No sweeping papal decree was issued to command their cessation or their sanction. Instead, the Church doubled down upon its long-standing practice, working quietly through personal intervention and whispered counsel to protect the accused where it could, to moderate the zeal of inquisitors, and to suppress the most dangerous of pamphlets. It was a fragile, desperate balancing act. One moment, a bishop might secretly intervene to save a woman from a secular court, spiriting her away to a convent under church protection. The next, a tribunal might allow a trial to proceed unchecked, fearing that intervention would stoke the flames of rebellion or invite charges of shielding the wicked. Even the Inquisition, often maligned by history as a force of unrelenting cruelty, found itself tangled in this web of contradictions. In some regions, inquisitors acted as brakes upon local hysteria, dismissing wild accusations and insisting upon the strictest standards of proof, standards few witchcraft trials could meet. In others, where local pressure proved too great, even inquisitors yielded, if only to preserve the fragile peace of the realm. The silent cover-up became not merely an act of concealment, but a desperate measure of damage control. And within the dim-lit chambers of the Vatican, where the walls echoed with centuries of prayers and secrets, cardinals debated with hushed voices. They spoke not only of theology, but of survival, of how long the Church could walk this narrow path before the weight of fear and bloodshed forced their hand. For even as they prayed for peace, the storm outside their doors grew darker, and in that growing darkness the whispered question remained: how much longer could silence hold back the flood? The dawn of the 17th century brought with it a restless wind that stirred not only the leaves of Europe's ancient forests, but also the deeply buried fears within its people. The landscape of Christendom stood cracked along the fault lines drawn by the Reformation. The old unity of the Church, once as solid as the stone walls of its cathedrals, now echoed with divisions that no council or edict could easily mend. In this fractured world, the old fears refused to die. Instead, they slipped between the cracks, taking new forms, wearing new faces, and none grew darker or more pervasive than the ever-morphing spectre of the witch. For the Church, whose silent campaign against witch hunts had stretched across centuries, this was a dangerous season. The quiet strategies once so effective, counselling moderation, shielding the accused, redirecting suspicion, now struggled to find footing in a world where civil courts, Protestant zealots, and even ambitious Catholic princes stirred fear into frenzy for their own ends. In certain Protestant lands, witch trials surged with a ferocity that made even hardened inquisitors shudder. Towns that once looked to the Church for guidance now answered to local magistrates and fervent ministers. And these ministers, unbound by Rome's cautious hand, often embraced the most lurid tales of witches consorting with the devil, poisoning crops, and corrupting souls. The Catholic Church watched with a mix of horror and helplessness. There were places where its influence remained strong, regions where bishops continued their quiet vigilance, steering priests to calm the waters and protect the vulnerable. In these enclaves, the old tactics of discreet intervention still bore fruit. A whispered word in the ear of a noble, a subtle sermon on the dangers of superstition, a carefully orchestrated transfer of an accused woman into ecclesiastical custody. These acts remained the Church's unseen shield against the worst excesses of the age. But even in Catholic strongholds, the tides of fear pressed harder. The 30 Years' War, ignited in the heart of Europe, became more than a clash of armies. It was a war of faiths, a grinding conflict that tore villages apart, turned neighbours into enemies, and deepened the cracks within the body of Christendom. Amid the smoke of battlefields and the ruin of once peaceful towns, old superstitions rekindled. For what else could explain the misery of war, the sudden deaths, the failing crops, the endless suffering? If not witches, then what? In this climate of despair, witch trials became weapons, not merely of fear, but of power. Secular rulers, needing to solidify their grip on frightened subjects, allowed trials to proceed under the guise of protecting their people. Inquisitors, wary of losing influence to civil authorities, sometimes chose silence over confrontation when trials began beyond their control. Even bishops, those faithful sentinels of Rome's cautious stance, found themselves walking ever thinner lines between doctrine and the demands of terrified flocks. Rome itself responded with the same tool it had wielded for centuries: silence wrapped in quiet action. No grand papal bull would denounce the witch hunts. No sweeping proclamation would call for their defense. Instead, the Vatican doubled down upon secret interventions. Trusted envoys were sent into regions teetering on the edge of hysteria. Jesuit scholars wrote treatises emphasizing reason and the dangers of superstition, treatises distributed not to the masses, but to the educated, the clergy, and those who held the levers of power. Confessions, ever a window into the fears of the faithful, became another quiet battlefield. Priests were instructed once again to steer confessions away from accusations of witchcraft. Where possible, they worked to replace fear with penance, suspicion with forgiveness. The seal of the confessional became both a shield for the accused and a tool for the church to monitor the pulse of fear within its flocks. Yet this subtle campaign met a new, insidious challenge: the rise of printed witch-hunting manuals. The most infamous among them, the Malleus Maleficarum, continued to haunt Europe like a shadow that refused to fade. Though the Church had never officially endorsed its teachings, and though many theologians denounced its brutality, its words found eager readers among magistrates, secular judges, and zealots alike. The spread of such works undercut centuries of quiet church guidance, replacing it with a grim manual for hysteria. The Vatican's response remained true to its silent path. Rather than publicly challenge such works, an act that might inflame the passions of a fearful populace, the Church worked to suppress them by quieter means. Monastic orders bought up copies where they could, removing them from public view. Bishops instructed their clergy to avoid referencing such texts in sermons or legal proceedings. Theologians engaged in private debates, writing refutations intended for scholars and judges rather than the common folk. It was, in every way, a silent war, one fought not with swords or decrees, but with whispers, letters, and the quiet strength of pastoral care. But even as the Church strained to hold back the flood, cracks appeared within its own ranks. Some priests, swayed by local fears or personal convictions, broke with the Church's cautious stance and endorsed witch hunts in their parishes. Some inquisitors, seeking influence or driven by genuine belief in the devil's work, sanctioned trials Rome would never have approved. And in these moments the silent cover-up faltered, leaving the Church scrambling to mend the wounds before they bled into scandal. In the shadow of these events, a creeping realization took root within the higher echelons of the Vatican. The silent containment they had relied upon for so long, the careful threading of pastoral care, theological restraint, and discreet intervention, was no longer enough. The age of whispered guidance was fading before the roar of a new world. A world where fear travelled faster than faith, where printed words wielded more power than sermons, and where civil courts no longer heeded the cautions of bishops. And yet, even with this realization, the Church chose not to abandon its silent path. For to embrace open opposition risked inflaming the very fires they sought to quench. To openly support the hunts would be a betrayal of everything the Church claimed to stand for. Thus they continued, steadfast, quiet, unwavering. The silent cover-up endured not out of ignorance or indifference, but because those who steered the helm of the Church understood a painful truth. In a world gripped by fear, the loudest voice might win the crowd, but only the quiet hand could hope to save the soul. And so, through the long nights of the 17th century, in the flickering candlelight of cloisters and the darkened halls of the Vatican, the silent guardians of the Church pressed on, ever watchful, ever cautious, against a storm that showed no sign of passing. As the 17th century advanced, a strange and haunting calm settled over parts of Europe, an uneasy lull in a tempest that had raged for generations. The great wars of religion still smouldered in their embers, the Peace of Westphalia weaving a fragile tapestry of truces and treaties that stitched across a divided continent. Yet beneath this political stillness, fear continued to seep into the quiet places where no treaty could reach. In the hearts of villagers, the whisper of witches remained a living thing. The Church, worn but vigilant, stood at a crossroads known only to those who laboured in its silent chambers. Centuries of cautious deflection and whispered interventions had slowed the rise of the witch hunts in some places, but in others, particularly within fractured principalities and the far reaches of rural lands, the tide had swollen beyond their reach. In these places, the silent cover-up faced its most subtle and dangerous adversary, indifference. Where once bishops and priests could calm a frightened flock with gentle counsel, now they often found their words falling upon ears tuned to a harsher song. Civil authorities, emboldened by decades of unchecked trials, paid less heed to the quiet voice of the Church. Local judges, mayors, and town councils grew accustomed to seeing witch trials not as spiritual crises, but as tools for maintaining order or settling disputes. The Church, for all its influence, could not be everywhere at once. And so new strategies of quiet containment emerged, softer, subtler, more intricate than before. In regions where Church influence remained strong, bishops began forging delicate alliances with secular leaders. These alliances were built not upon proclamations or shared doctrines, but upon shared fears. Fears of unrest, of peasant revolts, of chaos spreading from unchecked hysteria. Bishops whispered into the ears of magistrates, suggesting the dangers of allowing trials to spiral into mass panic. They appealed to theology, but to pragmatism. "It is not the witch that threatens your town," one bishop wrote to a nervous baron in the Rhineland, "but the mob that may rise when fear turns to frenzy." Such appeals often found fertile ground. Secular lords, wary of losing control over their territories, began to weigh the cost of public hysteria against the fleeting satisfaction of a show trial. In some places, this delicate diplomacy succeeded. Trials were quietly halted, accusations dismissed with little fanfare, and suspects allowed to vanish quietly into the care of church-run refuges. But in other places, the church's hand slipped. In the territories of Franconia, Bamberg, and Würzburg, secular trials erupted into deadly spectacles of mass accusation and execution. The church's envoys moved swiftly, but often too late. By the time they arrived, dozens, sometimes hundreds, had already been condemned. The Vatican's policy of silent intervention, so effective when fear lingered in the shadows, faltered when that fear erupted into daylight. In response, the Church began to change the way it fought this quiet war. Instead of acting only after panic arose, bishops and cardinals began to plant seeds of restraint ahead of time. Seminaries took on a new, quiet mission: to train parish priests not only in theology and scripture, but in the subtle arts of calming fear. Preaching manuals were written with careful attention to language, emphasizing sermons that promoted charity, neighborly love, and the sinfulness of false accusations. Confessional guidance became a tool of quiet defense. When parishioners confessed their fears of witches, priests were instructed to redirect those fears gently but firmly toward reflection on personal sin. The question was never asked, "Who do you suspect?" but rather, "What fear burdens your heart?" The confessional became both a shield for the accused and a mirror for the fearful, an unseen line of defense in the Church's silent campaign. Yet even these careful measures struggled against the growing power of printed word. Pamphlets and broadsheets continued to spread tales of witchcraft with a speed and reach that no pulpit could match. Tales of covens, devilish rites, and dark conspiracies poured from the presses of both Protestant and Catholic regions. Some of these works were written by opportunists, others by true believers. The Church, seeing its carefully tended message drowned beneath this flood, could do little more than act as a silent editor, buying up copies, suppressing their distribution, encouraging printers loyal to the Church to refuse such commissions. The silent cover-up became a labor of exhaustion, a weary, constant effort to hold back a flood with nothing but whispered words and unseen hands. And then, a curious shift began to ripple through Europe's intellectual circles. The rise of rationalism, the slow, questioning hum of new thought, began to stir in the universities, salons, and courts of Europe. Philosophers, scientists, and jurists started to challenge the old tales of witches, not out of loyalty to the Church, but from a growing belief in reason and empirical proof. The Church, though wary of some Enlightenment ideals, saw in this a strange and unexpected ally. Rather than oppose these new voices, some within the Church quietly encouraged them. Theologians of sharp mind and gentle tongue began to correspond with scholars who questioned witch trials, sharing arguments about the dangers of superstition and the need for evidence over rumor. Jesuit colleges, known for their rigorous education, introduced teachings that examine the difference between faith and folklore. Though careful never to abandon their belief in the reality of evil, these scholars steered discussions away from witchcraft toward broader theological and philosophical debates. It was a subtle shift, but it mattered. The Church's silent campaign adapted, moving alongside the rising tide of reason rather than against it. They understood, perhaps better than the scholars themselves, that fear is a weed best starved of soil, not pulled by the root. The less ground given to superstition, the fewer witches the world would claim to see. And so, the silent cover-up continued, not as a desperate defense, but as a quiet guide steering the fearful toward calmer waters. In Rome, where the marble halls echoed with the soft footfalls of cardinals and scholars alike, this strategy took deeper root. No grand declarations were made, No sweeping condemnations of the witch hunts were issued. Instead, the church continued its careful dance, a slow, deliberate movement within the shadows of Europe's changing heart. They could not undo the fear. They could not erase the blood already spilled. But they could, with soft hands and unseen words, help bring about a future where fear no longer ruled the hearts of men. And in that quiet hope, the silent cover-up endured, patient, watchful, and ever determined beneath the weight of centuries. As the 18th century edged its way into the fabric of European life, a curious stillness fell upon the storm that had once howled so fiercely. The great bonfires that had burned in the name of witch trials dimmed, their embers fading into the ashes of distant memory in many corners of the continent. The dark tide of hysteria, which had surged so powerfully in the past, began to ebb, not with a single decree or dramatic upheaval, but with the slow, measured fading that comes when a long-feared shadow finally loses its grip on the imagination of men. But this quieting of fear was no sudden victory, nor a simple turning of the age. It was in large part the fruit of that tireless, silent campaign the Church had waged for centuries. A campaign fought not with swords nor with public proclamations, but with careful counsel, whispered interventions, and a steadfast refusal to yield to the tides of panic. And now, with the dawn of enlightenment, thought casting its pale glow over the cities and courts of Europe, the Church found itself in a strange and paradoxical position. The very voices that once viewed the Church with suspicion, scholars, jurists, and philosophers, began to echo the warnings the Church had long whispered behind closed doors. Witchcraft, they declared, was a folly of ignorance, a remnant of a darker age. Trials based on rumour and confession extracted under torture were denounced as stains upon human reason. The pamphlets and treatises that once stoked the flames of hysteria were slowly replaced by works that questioned, even mocked, the idea of witches wielding power through pacts with the devil. And the Church, so often painted by these same intellectuals as a bastion of superstition, now stood quietly aligned with them on this single, peculiar front. Within the marble chambers of the Vatican there were no celebrations, no proclamations of triumph. Instead there was a gentle but profound sense of relief, a release of breath long held. The storm they had worked so hard to quell was at last weakening. Yet this did not mean the silent cover-up ended. On the contrary, it shifted into a new form, a quiet vigilance that watched the dying embers of the witch hunts, ensuring they did not flare to life once more. Bishops, many now men of learning and calm temperament, continued to counsel their clergy on the dangers of superstition. In seminaries, the teachings of earlier centuries, lessons on pastoral care and the importance of tempering fear with reason, were refined, woven into the daily instruction of those who would serve in parishes across Europe. The Inquisition itself, so often the subject of dark legend, evolved. In regions where it remained active, its focus shifted almost entirely away from witchcraft. Its members, many now scholars rather than zealots, turned their gaze toward matters of doctrine and theological consistency, rather than chasing shadows through darkened villages. In some cases, inquisitors became protectors, stepping in to prevent local courts from reviving old accusations, using their authority to dismiss cases before they could ignite public panic. In Rome, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, descended from the ancient Holy Office, maintained records of past trials, not to glorify them, but as a somber reminder of where fear could lead. These records, once secreted away in dusty vaults, began to be quietly studied by scholars seeking to understand the errors of the past. The Church, by preserving these documents in silence, offered a quiet confession to history, a silent acknowledgement of the delicate balance between faith, fear, and reason. And yet, even in this quieter age, sparks remained. In rural corners of Europe, far from the salons of Paris and the lecture halls of London, the old whispers lingered. Superstition is a stubborn weed, and the fear of witches did not vanish overnight. There were still isolated accusations, still small trials conducted in secret by local authorities beyond the Church's reach. In some places, dark deeds still unfolded in shadows, the quiet persecution of those deemed strange or other. The Church responded as it always had, with soft hands and silent intervention. A parish priest might be quietly reassigned to a troubled village, tasked not with grand sermons, but with the slow, patient work of calming hearts and redirecting fears. A bishop might send a trusted envoy, a learned man of calm disposition, to counsel a fearful town council against rash actions. And when cases did arise, rare but never absent, the church moved quietly behind the scenes to temper justice with mercy. These interventions rarely made it into the pages of history. They were not the grand affairs of statecraft or theology, but quiet moments of human care. The whispered word, the gentle counsel, the unseen hand that turned fear away from the path of bloodshed. And in this long, slow fading of the witch hunts, the church found itself strangely changed. The centuries of silent struggle had left a mark, not just upon the world, but upon the church itself. A deeper awareness of the power of fear, a humbler approach to authority, a clearer sense of the delicate thread that binds faith to the hearts of the faithful. These were not lessons learned from councils or decrees, but from centuries of quiet labor in the shadows. And yet, in the quieter corners of its heart, the church never forgot how close the world had come to losing itself in the madness of fear. It remembered the villages burned in the name of righteousness, the innocent lives taken beneath the guise of justice, the moments when even its own hands had faltered in the face of the mob. It remembered the cost of silence that came too late, and the price of words spoken too loudly. So the silent cover-up did not vanish with the witch hunts. It became something quieter still, a memory, a watchful eye, a whisper in the heart of an institution that had stood through centuries of storm and shadow. And in the hush of candlelit chapels, beneath the soaring arches of cathedrals, and within the simple prayers of parish priests, that quiet vigilance remained, ever watchful, ever waiting, a silent promise that, should the shadows rise again, there would be hands, quiet, unseen, ready to hold back the dark. In the quiet hush following the final tolling of the Abbey's midnight bell, Sister Aveline slipped through the vaulted arch of the chapter house, her lantern casting a gentle golden glow that trembled across the etched stone walls. The embers of the evening fire in the hearth had died down, leaving only the memory of warmth. Beneath the lantern's soft light, the fanned folios of her codex glimmered, unleashing pale ribbons of illumination that seemed almost to breathe as she advanced. In silence, she took her accustomed place at the polished oak table, cushioned in quilted velvet, her slender fingers already itching with anticipation. In those same candlelit halls, Brother Mathis lingered near the entrance, his hood drawn close, not to shield his face, but to sheath his racing heart from prying eyes. The matter he carried in his mind weighed far heavier than the heavy keys at his belt. Ever since the dreadful events within the forest village of Montreuil, the abbey had fallen under a hush more profound than the mere absence of speech. To speak of that place was to breathe life into memories the church preferred to smother in silence. Yet necessity had driven Mathis to this meeting. There were records to destroy, truths to conceal, names to redact. Aveline did not look up. Her eyes were already wandering, tracing the moss-green inks across the vellum. Each letter, every marginal doodle or caret symbol, bore testament to the church's hand in sculpting the narrative. Witches were sorcerers. Witches were instruments of Satan. Witches deserved the fire. But Mathis placed the small packet, crumbled parchment sealed in red wax, upon the table. "Your work tonight," he murmured, "will bury 3 more names." Aveline paused. The names within that scroll had been whispered and spread through villages like shadows at dusk. Dozens had already been sacrificed. These 3 were the daughters of a local hedgewoman of Montreuil, the same woman accused of cursing the archbishop. The girl sisters were innocent, of that Aveline felt certain, but the church could not risk scandal. She dipped her quill in ink. Her breath caught in the hush. Even the distant drip of water from the stone arches seemed to pause, as if the abbey itself waited. Outside, the moon carved slivered memories across the grounds. A pale light cupped the ivy-laced walls, revealing shadows of gargoyles perched in silent guardianship. Their lipless mouths seemed frozen in accusation. In the cloister, the echo of a solitary monk reciting the office drifted like gilded smoke rising through the night. Unseen, a small bird chirped once, startling the solitude. Inside the chapter house, Aveline's quill scratched furiously as each name was carefully struck. Each stroke severed not only the name from the list, but also the identity of a living soul. The church's ledger, already bloated with accusations, would now omit them altogether. Mathis watched, his silhouette shaded by the lantern light. "Make sure there's no trace," he whispered. "Remove any mention. No servants, no bailiffs, no letters." She dipped the quill again. In the hush, she could almost hear the hush of wind in winter woods, an echo of Montre's tormented howls. Hours passed. The column of vapour from her exhaled breath dissipated as Aveline finally laid down her quill. The parchment on the table, now scarred with slashes and punitive black ink, held nothing but tarnished references to the hedge woman's other children. Even the phrase "wolves at dusk" had been erased. Mathis took the scroll, examined it closely under the lantern's glow. "No trace of them," he said at last. Aveline nodded, but her heart pinched. Each erasure felt like a star snuffed from the sky. Mathis handed her a small vial of water. "To cleanse your truth," he said. She drank it, grimacing at the bitter taste. "You did well," he added, though his tone held no warmth. "But that is only half of it. Tomorrow you will summon the local scribes. You will dictate a new register, one that censures these names entirely." She nodded again, though fear coiled in her chest. The abbey demanded obedience, and between light and darkness there was only silence. Alone again, she extinguished the lantern and retreated through the silent galleries to her cell. The stone walls were cold. Her breath came in slow, measured whispers. Beneath her cloak, she pressed the edge of the cupboard drawer, where she hid a single scrap of the original register. 3 names in her neat script, a record she refused to burn. When the abbey's bell tolled once more, marking the hour before sunrise, Aveline slipped from her cell into the cloister's embrace. The world was still unborn, wrapped in fog so thin that fingers of mist crept across the grass. She carried the scrap in a parcel of cloth stitched from old robes. Her mind drifted back to Montreal's villagers, their eyes gleaming with hope at the sight of her. She remembered the elder's prayer at the trough dawn. "Bless us, sister, that the echo of fire may be silenced." She descended into the ancient crypt beneath the chapel, where the bones of monks from centuries past lay heaped beneath low arches. Those bones would testify if anyone dared infringe upon that sacred space. She placed the scrap in a crack between stone blocks, praying that it remained hidden. Nearby, an owl stirred among the ribs of fallen rafters. The creature's broad eyes blinked once. In that moment, Aveline felt the weight of the unborn dawn, complex, untamed, and trembling. With that, she ascended, leaving the crypt behind, encased in silence. Above, the abbey stirred once more, preparing for matins. Light seeped through carved tracery, and the soft radiance of morning eased her troubled heart. At the altar steps, the prior awaited, arms raised in benediction. The moment Aveline joined the choir, the hush of stone and dew and breath became whole again. She sang. Notes in Latin, hushed and plaintive, the melody rising like incense through the nave. In that song, but unheard by others, she wove a prayer for those who would vanish tomorrow from the church's ledger, a prayer so faint yet pure, for witch hunts would persist, carried on in drifting rumours and ecclesiastical decrees. The abbey's hand would continue to shape the narrative, but in the secret folds of stone and song, the truth, no matter how delicate, would endure. And so the new day began, as it always did, procession after procession, chant after chant. The instruments of control polished and wielded with devout precision. But in the shadows, Sister Aveline carried a tiny spark, like embers preserved in a night-black cradle, ready to kindle curiosity, sow empathy, awaken the conscience of the next soul who learned to listen to silence. Here, in the hush before dawn's full arrival, lay the quiet possibility of truth. A fragile seed planted beneath centuries, waiting for one soul brave enough to lift the veil. The sun's early ascent spilled muted gold over the cobbled stones of Saint-Denis Abbey, yet the air within its walls remained cool and shrouded in the reverent hush of ancient devotion. The chapter house was empty now, its grand oak table cleared of both ink and intrigue, as though the whispers of the previous night had never brushed its hallowed surface. But beneath this crafted stillness, a careful tide of manoeuvring stirred, unseen, deliberate, and suffused with the quiet cunning of clerics who had long mastered the subtle art of concealment. Brother Mathis stood in the cloister's east arcade, his hands folded behind his back, eyes set upon the fountain at the centre of the quadrangle. The water there danced in soft arcs, its song mingling with the soft murmur of wind weaving through the columns. With each ripple of water, his mind replayed the sequence of events that must now unfold. The records of Montreux would vanish, not by fire, nor by the crude hand of a careless scribe, but through the more insidious method the Church had perfected over generations, the erosion of memory itself. Memory, Mathis mused, could be bent, softened like wax in the palm of ecclesiastical authority. Documents mattered little when the hearts and tongues of those who knew the truth were steadily silenced or redirected, and today would be the first of many small adjustments. He would begin with the scribes. From the shadows of the arcade emerged Brother Lucien, the youngest of the Abbey's chroniclers, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that flickered like restless embers. Mathis beckoned him with a mere tilt of his head. Lucien approached, his hands clasped before him, reverent but alert. "You summoned me, brother?" Lucien asked, bowing slightly. "I did," Mathis replied softly, never taking his eyes off the fountain. "There are discrepancies in the Montreux account, a matter of names, an error of transcription, I fear." Lucien frowned, confusion knitting his brow. "I do not recall." Mathis turned then, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You will. By the time we are finished, you will recall that the 3 daughters of the hedgewoman never existed. Their names never crossed your ledger. Do you understand?" A tremor flickered at the edge of Lucien's mouth, but he masked it swiftly. "Of course, brother. You will amend the archives. Any reference, however slight, will be removed. And should you hear mention of them by others, you will correct them, gently. The Abbey's memory must remain unblemished." Lucien nodded, though his eyes lingered on Mathis's face a moment too long, as if weighing some silent question. In that pause a shard of hesitation gleamed, a sliver of conscience perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "It will be done," Lucien murmured. Mathis offered a faint smile. "Good. The Abbey thanks you." As Lucien turned away, the faint echo of his footsteps blending with the murmuring fountain, Mathis allowed himself a long, measured breath. One by one, the threads of memory would be rewoven. The scribes would forget. The witnesses would falter. The tongues of the laity would shift with the winds of church doctrine. This was how the story would be rewritten, not with violence, not with proclamations, but with the quiet, relentless certainty of silence itself. Later that morning, beneath the vaulted ceiling of the scriptorium, the soft hum of quills scraping vellum formed a curious kind of music. Aveline moved among the scribes, her hands clasped, her presence calm and unobtrusive. Her eyes skimmed the texts, observing the slow, deliberate revisions taking shape under the monk's careful hands. Each name that vanished from the page felt like a thread pulled from a vast, unseen tapestry. And with every pulled thread, the fabric of truth loosened further. Lucien sat at the nearest desk, hunched over a folio, his quill dancing lightly as he amended the ledger under Mathis's watchful eye. Aveline paused beside him, her gaze resting on the soft sweep of ink across the page. The names were gone. In their place, silence. "Will this be enough?" Lucien asked softly, not daring to meet her eyes. Aveline hesitated. Her heart swayed beneath a burden she could neither name nor release. "For now," she whispered, "it will be enough." But even as she spoke, a strange unease coiled within her. She wondered if silencing the written word truly sufficed to erase a memory. Could the whisper of a mother's wail, the glimpse of a child's fearful eyes, be so easily undone? And within the hollows of her heart, a different question stirred, one she dared not voice. Who decides whose memory deserves to endure? As the scriptorium's hum enveloped her, Aveline turned away, her cloak trailing soft shadows behind her. The monks resumed their quiet labour, the only evidence of their work the faint scent of ink and the ghost of words now vanished. Yet outside these walls, beyond the Abbey's serene facade, the world remained restless. By midday, rumours began to ripple across Montreux's neighbouring villages. The hedgewoman's daughters were missing, some whispered. Others claimed they had been seen taken by soldiers of the church. Yet no edict of trial had been read in the square, no names sung from the pulpit. In time, the murmurs faded, softened by the steady chant of sermons and the weight of the church's unspoken will. In this manner, memory itself was reshaped, not by force, but by slow attrition. And so the Abbey's quiet labour continued, carving away the edges of truth until the jagged bones of reality lay smoothed beneath a polished veneer of piety and control. As evening settled, Aveline returned to the crypt beneath the chapel, her steps light, her heart heavy. Beneath the silent gaze of ancient saints carved in stone, she knelt where she had hidden the fragment of truth, the 3 names scrawled in ink that trembled even now beneath her touch. For a moment, she imagined the faces of the 3 sisters. Faces she had never seen, but felt she somehow knew. In the quiet, she whispered their names, her voice a mere thread in the cavernous dark. And in that moment, beneath the Abbey's sacred stones, her heart became a vault of remembrance, a silent defiance against the creeping amnesia the Church sought to impose. For she understood now that memory, like the faintest ember, could be preserved. And sometimes all it took was one heart, resolute, unwavering, to keep the flame alive amidst the encroaching shadows of silence. A week passed in silent procession beneath the cloisters of Saint-Denis Abbey, where the wheel of ecclesiastical life turned with unerring, deliberate rhythm. Morning prayers, scripture readings, silent meals, and the soft cadence of Gregorian chant seemed to cradle the monks and sisters within a cocoon of timeless ritual. Yet beneath this veil of piety, the quiet machinery of erasure continued its patient work, winding ever tighter around the fragile remnants of Montreux's vanished daughters. The scriptorium remained a hive of quiet industry, its windows streaming soft shafts of golden light that bathed the faces of scribes bent over their scrolls. Among them, Brother Lucien worked in silence, his ink-stained hands moving with practiced ease. Yet with each line he penned, with each name he carefully omitted or excised, a slow-burning question took root within him, a question that pressed against his heart like a thorn concealed beneath velvet. Was it truly righteous to alter history in this way? He dared not speak of it. The walls of the Abbey had a way of listening, of twisting stray whispers into the winds of judgment. Yet the thought persisted, haunting him in the quiet hours before dawn, when even the sacred chants seemed thin and brittle. One evening, long after the final bell of Compline had sounded, and the Abbey's stones slumbered in hush, Lucien found himself in the library's far corner, a dim alcove where ancient scrolls slumbered beneath a patina of dust and time. His lantern cast a soft circle of light over a manuscript of peculiar interest, a register of inquisitorial acts from decades past, chronicling trials, accusations, and condemnations. He traced the entries with a trembling finger. Here were names, dozens of them, marked with red ink, denoting those who had been declared guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to fire. Yet among the names he noticed something curious. There were gaps, curious blank spaces in the lines where names ought to have been recorded. Whole entries struck through, entire testimonies blotted by careful hands. This was not the work of a careless scribe. This was deliberate. A chill swept over Lucien as understanding settled upon him. The practice of erasure was no recent endeavour. It had roots deep within the very marrow of the Church's history. Generations before him had partaken in this quiet art of forgetting, a lineage of omission as meticulously preserved as the illuminated Gospels. He closed the manuscript softly, a strange reverence, or was it dread, coiling within his chest. Was he merely another link in a chain stretching backward into shadowed centuries? And if so, where would it end? A soft step behind him broke his reverie. He turned swiftly, heart leaping, only to find Aveline standing there, her expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. "You should be resting," she said softly. Lucien swallowed. "I wish to understand." Her gaze softened and she stepped closer, the faint scent of lavender trailing in her wake. "Understand what? Why this is done? Why we erase them? The names, the lives? Why does the Church need to bury them beneath silence?" Aveline's eyes held his, deep pools of quiet sorrow. For a long moment she said nothing, the silence between them stretching thin as spun glass. "Because," she whispered at last, "truth is a fragile vessel. The Church fears it will shatter if too many hands reach for it." Her words hung in the air, soft yet heavy with the weight of unspoken understanding. Lucien looked down at his hands, the stains of ink dark against his pale skin. And what if the truth is already broken? Aveline's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile, one touched with sadness rather than mirth. Then it becomes our task to gather the fragments, quietly, patiently, before they are lost forever. The lantern's glow seemed to soften around them, the dust motes dancing in its light like fading memories. In that quiet alcove amidst the slumbering scrolls, something delicate passed between them. Not defiance, not rebellion, but the quiet acknowledgement of shared burden. Aveline reached into the folds of her habit and withdrew a small strip of parchment, faded, worn at the edges. With gentle fingers she pressed it into Lucien's hand. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes widening as he recognized the name scrawled upon it, the three sisters of Montreuil, preserved in Aveline's careful hand. "I cannot carry this alone," she whispered. "If ever you doubt, remember them." Lucien closed his fingers around the parchment, feeling its fragile weight settle against his palm. His heart thudded in a rhythm both solemn and strange, a quiet oath forming in the space between them. "I will," he breathed. Aveline nodded once, a faint glimmer of something, hope, perhaps, dancing in her eyes. Without another word, she turned and slipped away into the shadowed corridors of the library, her steps as silent as a whispered prayer. Lucien remained standing there for a long while, the scrap of memory clasped to his chest. The soft murmur of wind stirred the pages around him, a gentle susurration like the echo of distant voices long silenced. And in that quiet, he felt it. The first fragile stirring of courage, the dawning realization that perhaps even in a world where silence reigned, memory could yet find sanctuary in hearts brave enough to bear its weight. Outside, the moon climbed higher, casting its pale gaze over the abbey's sleeping stones. The night pressed on, wrapped in shadows and secrets. Yet beneath its silent canopy, two hearts now carried a flame too quiet to be seen, too stubborn to be snuffed, a flame of remembrance, flickering softly against the encroaching dark. The dawn of the next morning arrived in softened hues, its gentle light folding over the abbey's spires as if hesitant to disturb the sanctity of its centuries-old walls. The bells chimed for lauds, their echoes ringing across the mist-shrouded fields beyond, calling the faithful from slumber into solemn prayer. Yet within the hearts of two souls, hidden among the countless that answered the summons, a quiet unrest began to stir, delicate as the first ripple on a glassy pond, yet persistent as the tide's pull. Brother Lucien joined the procession with his head bowed, the secret parchment tucked within the folds of his robe. The cadence of the psalms rose around him, voices intertwining in a tapestry of reverence. But amid the solemn chant, his heart thudded with a strange discord. Each note seemed to amplify the silent question echoing within him. What had become of the three sisters whose names he now carried in trembling script? He dared not ask Mathis. The senior brother's eyes, sharp and discerning, would read the question before it ever crossed Lucien's lips. Nor could he speak openly with Aveline. Though they shared a fragile bond sealed by silent understanding, any misstep could draw the abbey's shadow upon them both. But questions, once born, do not die easily. They linger, haunting the mind's quiet corners, whispering in the hush of prayer, in the flicker of candlelight upon stone. And so it was that after the office of Lords, while the brothers filed into the refectory for their morning meal, Lucien veered quietly toward the west wing, toward the abbey's small infirmary. Brother Gervais, the infirmarian, was a man of few words and quieter footsteps. He tended to those who fell ill or returned from the church's darker errands. The inquiries, the interrogations, the whispered trials beyond the abbey's walls. If anyone knew what became of the accused before their names vanished from record, it was Gervais. Lucien found him seated by the open shutters of the infirmary, grinding dried herbs into a fine powder with methodical care. The soft rasp of the pestle was the only sound in the chamber, save for the gentle coo of doves nesting in the eaves. "Brother Gervais," Lucien greeted, keeping his tone respectful, eyes lowered. Gervais glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Brother Lucien, what brings you?" Lucien hesitated, then stepped closer. "I wish to understand the nature of certain inquiries, of those accused of witchcraft." The pestle stilled in Gervais's hand. For a moment, the infirmarian said nothing. Then, with a slow deliberation, he set the mortar aside and folded his hands upon his lap. "Why ask me?" Gervais inquired, his voice low, almost a murmur. Lucien met his gaze, steady though his heart trembled. "Because you tend to those who return from such inquiries. I wish to know what becomes of the accused after the records are amended." A faint shadow crossed Gervais's face, something sharp and fleeting as a passing storm cloud. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you care?" The question was soft, devoid of accusation, yet carrying a weight Lucien felt keenly. He answered with the only truth he dared speak. "Because I believe there are those who suffer unseen, and perhaps unremembered." The infirmarian studied him for a long, breathless moment. Then, with a soft sigh, Gervais rose from his seat and gestured for Lucien to follow. They moved in silence through a narrow corridor, descending a small flight of stone steps into a chamber beneath the infirmary. It was a place Lucien had never entered, a small, dim room smelling faintly of earth and lavender, lined with narrow cots. Upon them lay figures shrouded in blankets. Some stirred faintly, murmuring incoherent words. Others lay deathly still, their faces pale, their eyes closed in troubled slumber. Lucien's breath caught in his throat. "These are the ones who return," Gervais said quietly. "Not all inquiries end in flames. Some end in silence. They are sent back, emptied of their names, their voices, their memories." Lucien stepped closer, his gaze falling upon a young woman no older than 18. Her hands clutched the edge of her blanket as though warding off unseen horrors. Her lips moved in a soundless whisper. "Who is she?" Lucien whispered. Gervais's expression darkened. "She was brought from Montreuil, one of the daughters, perhaps. I was never told her name." A soft gasp escaped Lucien's lips, the parchment in his robe seeming to burn against his heart. "They did not execute her?" "No," Gervais replied, his voice low. "But in some ways this is worse. They break them, shatter their minds with fear, with torment. They return them here to be forgotten, to fade." Lucien closed his eyes, his heart thundering. The church did not merely erase names, it hollowed lives, unmade them until even memory itself unraveled. The cruelty was not only in the death they dealt, but in the living oblivion they imposed. "And the others?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Most are sent away, to convents, to asylums. Some simply disappear." Gervais's eyes softened, touched with something akin to sorrow. "And none remember their names, none speak of them again." Lucien stood in silent agony, staring at the fragile form before him, a name hidden in ink within his robe, and a soul lying in oblivion before his eyes. The weight of it pressed upon him, a burden beyond confession, beyond prayer. "You asked why I care," Lucien murmured, his voice trembling. "I care, because someone must." Gervais placed a hand upon his shoulder, a touch neither commanding nor dismissive, but strangely gentle. "Then carry that care quietly, brother," the infirmarian whispered, "or you may soon join them." They remained there a moment longer, two shadows amidst forgotten souls. And as Lucien turned to leave, his heart bore not only the names written on parchment, but the silent vow forged in that hollow chamber beneath the abbey, a vow to remember, even when the world conspired to forget. Above them, the bells tolled for prime, their notes ringing clear into the morning light. But beneath the abbey, amidst the forgotten and the broken, the quiet resistance of a single heart began to take root, a silent defiance against the suffocating tide of sanctioned oblivion. The days that followed seemed, on the surface, no different from the countless others that had folded into the life of Saint-Denis Abbey. The monks and sisters moved through their appointed hours with measured grace, chanting, copying, praying, each a thread in the grand tapestry of sacred routine. The bells rang on schedule, the incense drifted in sweet curls beneath the high arches, and the rituals of faith continued, unbroken and undisturbed. Yet beneath this facade, a quiet current pulsed, a current known only to two hearts that now bore the silent weight of forbidden knowledge. Brother Lucien returned to the scriptorium, his hands steady but his heart in silent revolt. The faces of the broken souls in Gervais's hidden chamber haunted his every waking moment. The girl from Montreuil, her name unknown, her mind undone by unseen torment, had become a shadow on his conscience, one that neither ink nor piety could erase. He copied the sacred texts by day, his quill dancing over the soft vellum. Psalms, gospels, decrees, all penned with the precision expected of a servant of the church. Yet with each stroke a quiet defiance grew within him, a resistance not of open rebellion, but of remembrance. With every name he omitted under Mathis's command, with every record he quietly altered, he committed the truth to his heart, holding it there, safe beyond the reach of erasure. It was a dangerous game, a silent act of treason, invisible to all but himself. And yet it gave him purpose amid the suffocating certainty of obedience. One evening, as twilight's soft mantle descended upon the abbey's cloisters, Lucien found himself drawn once more to the library's secluded alcove. The parchment bearing the names of the three sisters remained hidden within the binding of an old psalter, a book rarely touched and never read aloud. He retrieved it now, his hands trembling as though he feared the weight of it might betray him. A soft footfall behind him made him turn, heart leaping. It was Aveline. She moved with her usual grace, her expression calm, though her eyes held a quiet intensity. Without speaking, she stepped closer, her gaze falling upon the fragile scrap of parchment in his hands. "You still have it," she whispered. Lucien nodded. I will not forget them." Aveline reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper. "Nor will I." They stood in silence for a long moment, the soft hush of the library enfolding them like a sacred veil. Beyond the thick stone walls, the abbey bell began its slow toll for vespers, a sound both solemn and serene, a reminder of the relentless march of sacred time. At last Luce spoke, his voice low. "Gervais showed me the ones they break but do not kill." Aveline's eyes flickered, a shadow passing across her face. "I have seen them too." Lucien swallowed hard, his voice tightening. How long has this been done?" Aveline's reply was a breath, softer than the candle's flicker. "Longer than we have drawn breath, longer than even our abbey's walls have stood." Her words struck him with the weight of a centuries-old truth. The Church's hand had shaped not only the written word but the memory of generations, bending, breaking, reshaping it to its will. "Is there nothing we can do?" he asked, the desperation in his voice muted but fierce. Aveline's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "There is always something." She drew a small bundle from beneath her cloak, a parcel wrapped in plain cloth. Carefully she unfolded it, revealing a slender codex bound in worn leather. Upon its cover no title was written, no emblem stamped. It was blank, unmarked, invisible. Lucien's eyes widened. "What is this?" Aveline's voice was a soft murmur, a ledger of remembrance. She opened the codex to reveal pages filled with careful script. Not official records, nor sanctioned accounts, but a quiet catalogue of names, places, events, all the truths the Church had sought to bury. Some entries were long, recounting whispered testimonies of those accused. Others were brief, a name, a date, a single word of remembrance, all written by Aveline's hand. "I began it years ago," she whispered. "Before Montree, before you arrived. A secret record, one that lives beyond the reach of fire and ink, hidden, unseen, but real." Lucien reached out, reverent as though touching a sacred relic. The names danced before his eyes, forgotten souls remembered here in silent defiance. "You kept this, alone?" Aveline nodded, "until now." She placed the codex gently in his hands. "I cannot carry it alone anymore, and neither should you." Lucien closed his fingers around the book, the weight of it unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. It felt alive, a quiet heartbeat within his grasp. "I will protect it," he vowed, his voice a breath of steel. Aveline smiled, a soft, fragile thing edged with sorrow and hope. "And I will continue to add to it." A hush fell between them, deeper than the silence of the library, more profound than any chant that echoed within the abbey's halls. In that moment, they became more than scribes, more than obedient servants of a silent regime. They became witnesses, keepers of memory, guardians of truth. Outside, the sky deepened to indigo, the first stars blinking into existence beyond the horizon's edge. The bells tolled once more, a soft summons to prayer. Yet within the heart of the abbey's silent walls, another summons stirred, a call that no bell could sound, no doctrine could quell. It was the quiet, enduring call of conscience. Lucien and Aveline exchanged a final glance, one that needed no words, no vow beyond the silent accord that bound them. Together they would remember. In the shadows, in the silence, against the encroaching tide of forgetfulness, they would hold the fragile flame of truth. And perhaps one day that quiet flame would kindle a fire no hand could extinguish. As the long summer's night settled over Saint-Denis Abbey, the hush of ancient stones grew thick with a presence that seemed almost tangible. The world beyond the abbey walls was veiled in velvet darkness, broken only by the soft song of crickets and the rhythmic croak of frogs from the marshes. Within the cloisters, pools of lamplight glowed faintly behind shuttered windows, casting dim halos upon the dew-slicked stones. In a small chamber beneath the western tower, a place long abandoned to silence, Lucien sat by a narrow desk, the secret ledger of remembrance open before him. Aveline's careful script lay upon the first pages, a steady hand chronicling stories that the church had sought to erase. Now, beside them, Lucien's own lines began to form, his ink weaving quiet testimonies into the growing tapestry of forbidden memory. He wrote of the sisters of Montreux, Clara, Isabeau, and Mireille, their names now etched in permanence beyond the reach of inquisitorial ink. He noted the elder of Montreuil, the one who had offered a whispered blessing in the village square, praying for the end of fire's echo. He recorded the faces he had seen in Gervaise's hidden infirmary, their hollow eyes and murmured fragments of lost selves. His hand trembled at times, the enormity of the task pressing upon him like the weight of 1,000 unwritten laments. Yet with each word, a quiet resolve steeled within his heart. The world's silence could be vast, but even a single voice, when given shape and script, might ripple across that stillness in ways unseen. Outside the chamber, the abbey stirred in its measured slumber. Brother Mathis paced within the chapter house, his mind wrapped in matters of doctrine and secrecy. The prior knelt in silent prayer before the altar, his whispered Latin a veil between his heart and the unsettling knowledge that rumours continued to stir in villages beyond the abbey's reach. Aveline moved as she often did, quiet, unseen, her steps threading between duty and hidden purpose. She gathered fragments of whispered confessions, gleaned stray mentions from wandering pilgrims, pressed gentle questions upon merchants who passed through the abbey's gates. Each whispered word, each hushed fear, became a seed planted within her silent ledger, a living testament to voices silenced by fear. One evening, as the sky hung in a canvas of deep indigo and silver, Lucien met Aveline beneath the shadow of the south bell tower. The air was cool, the breeze tinged with the faint scent of heather and old stone. Aveline approached, her hands folded within the sleeves of her habit, her expression composed yet edged with something restless, an undercurrent of quiet urgency. "You've heard the news," she whispered as she joined him in the sheltered alcove. Lucien nodded. "Another accusation, this time in the village of Saint-Hilaire." Aveline's eyes darkened, a mother and her young son. Lucien exhaled, the breath escaping him like a soft sigh. "Will they face trial?" Aveline shook her head, her voice a mere thread in the night's hush. "No trial. The church has declared them vanished, the boy only 7 years old." For a long moment neither spoke. The wind stirred between them, soft as a whispered prayer, the same grim pattern repeating with chilling precision. Names whispered, then struck away, lives reduced to rumour and shadow. "How do we stop this?" Lucien asked, his voice low but fierce. Aveline turned to him, her gaze steady beneath the pale light of the half-moon. "We do not stop it, not yet, but we remember, we witness, and in time we share what must be known." Lucien met her eyes, searching for some glimpse of the strength she so quietly bore. "Will that be enough?" A faint smile touched Aveline's lips, touched with both sorrow and hope. The church guards its truths in stone and ink, but even stone crumbles, even ink fades. Memory, when carried heart to heart, can outlive both. She drew a folded scrap of parchment from within her robe, another name, another fragment of a stolen story. She pressed it gently into Lucien's hand. His fingers closed around it, a quiet vow unspoken between them. "Add this," she whispered. Lucien nodded, the weight of the hidden ledger pressing against his heart. They parted in silence, their footsteps fading into the hush of the abbey's ancient stones. Yet as Lucien returned to his chamber, a new awareness pulsed within him, a fragile thread connecting him not only to Aveline, but to the countless forgotten souls whose names they now bore in silent remembrance. He opened the ledger once more, his quill trembling slightly as he added the new name, the mother of Saint-Hilaire, and her son, no more than a child, swallowed by the church's silent decree. As the ink dried upon the page, a thought stirred within him, an image of countless names, countless stories, woven together in a tapestry too vast to be hidden forever. And for the first time, amidst the shadows of secrecy and the suffocating silence imposed by power, Lucien allowed himself a fragile hope. A hope that one day perhaps memory would rise like a tide against the darkness, carrying with it the voices long silenced. For now he would write. For now he would remember, and in the sacred hush before the dawn, that quiet labour felt as mighty as any proclamation. The midsummer air hung thick over Saint-Denis Abbey, cloaking the cloisters in a quiet heaviness that seemed to dampen even the softest footsteps. Yet beneath the sombre weight of the season, a subtle shift stirred, an undercurrent that hummed just beneath the surface of ordered prayers and meticulously penned scripture. It was not rebellion, nor was it open defiance. It was something older, something quieter, more enduring, remembrance. In the cool shadows of the crypt, where centuries of bones lay cradled beneath silent arches, Lucien knelt before the hidden alcove where the ledger of remembrance now lay wrapped in cloth and bound with simple twine. Each night, after the final prayers of Compline, he came here alone, unseen by any but the silent dead. Here, amid the scent of ancient stone and wax, he wrote. Tonight was no different. He unwrapped the ledger with reverent care. The soft scrape of cloth against stone, barely a whisper in the tomb's embrace. His quill hovered over the opened page as he traced the delicate lines of script Aveline had begun, and he now continued, a silent chronicle of names, of vanished lives, of voices cast into oblivion. Tonight, he added the mother and son from Saint-Hilaire, Marie and Thomas. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as though each stroke of ink anchored their memory more firmly against the encroaching tide of forgetfulness. And as his hand moved, a thought came unbidden, a memory of Thomas's face, though he had never seen it. A child, wide-eyed with fear, clutching his mother's hand as strangers in clerical robes came to lead them away. Lucien closed his eyes. In the hush, he whispered their names, softly, as though that alone might summon their spirits to this hidden sanctuary of remembrance. When the entry was complete, he folded the ledger closed, hands lingering upon its worn cover. He could not name the force that stirred within him. Neither hope nor defiance, perhaps something more fragile, more human. The quiet belief that to remember was to resist, that to hold a name within the heart was to guard a light against the devouring dark. Behind him, a soft footfall stirred the silence. He turned sharply, heart tightening, but relaxed as Aveline's form emerged from the shadows beyond the arch. Her hood was drawn low, her steps soundless against the stone floor. "I thought you might be here," she whispered. Lucien rose slowly, wrapping the ledger once more in its cloth. "I could not leave them unremembered." Aveline's lips curved in a faint, solemn smile. "Nor should you." They stood a moment in the soft hush of the crypt, the faint flicker of a distant candle casting wavering shadows upon the ancient walls. Around them, the silent bones of monks long gone seemed to bear silent witness to their quiet conspiracy of memory. "There is word from the south," Aveline murmured, stepping closer. "A woman from Béziers, accused without trial, her family driven into hiding. The pattern repeats." Lucien's hands tightened around the wrapped ledger. "Do you know her name?" Aveline nodded, her voice a hush. "Isolde, a healer, one of those they call wise women. She vanished last fortnight." Lucien felt the familiar weight settle upon his heart. Another life stolen, another memory poised upon the edge of erasure. "I will write it," he said quietly. Aveline's eyes softened, her gaze holding his for a heartbeat longer. "One day, Lucien, others must know what we keep here. It cannot remain hidden forever." He met her gaze, the truth of her words, folding into the silent vow that had grown between them. "When the time is right." She nodded, the faintest glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned and slipped back into the shadows, her figure soon swallowed by the crypt's ancient gloom. Lucien remained a moment longer, the ledger pressed against his chest. The air around him seemed to hum with a quiet life of its own, the echo of voices that might have been, the soft weight of names remembered. And for the first time, he realized this labor of remembrance was not merely an act of defiance or duty. It was a prayer whispered not in the grand halls of cathedrals nor sung by choirs in gilded sanctuaries, but murmured in the heart's quiet chambers, guarded by the silent dead and borne on the ink-stained hands of those who dared remember. As he made his way from the crypt, the first notes of Matins' bell echoed faintly across the abbey grounds. Dawn, pale and trembling, touched the sky's edge beyond the eastern cloister, and within that hush before the world stirred anew, Lucien felt it. A fragile, enduring faith not in the church, nor in the fragile promises of men, but in the quiet power of memory. The belief that even in a world bent upon forgetting, to remember was to keep a piece of the world's soul alive. In silence, he walked into the gathering dawn, the ledger hidden beneath his robe, its weight both burden and blessing. And the names he carried whispered softly in his heart, like embers banked against the coming dark. The days that followed unfolded in their quiet, relentless rhythm. The abbey, with its ancient stones and sacred rites, remained a bastion of tranquil devotion to all who gazed upon it. Pilgrims came and went, monks laboured in scriptoriums, and the bells marked the passage of hours with a solemnity untouched by the silent defiance taking root within its walls. But beneath this gilded facade, the quiet work of remembrance pressed on, deepening like roots threading through the dark earth. Brother Lucien found himself growing ever more careful in his movements. Each journey to the crypt became a measured act of discretion, each new entry in the ledger a silent thread woven into a tapestry none but he and Aveline could see. And though his heart trembled with each whispered name, a strange strength grew within him, a resolve carved from the knowledge that even the smallest act of memory could stand against the slow, grinding tide of oblivion. It was on a dusky evening, as the abbey's shadow stretched long across the soft fields beyond, that a new ripple stirred the still waters of their quiet resistance. Aveline appeared at the door of the scriptorium, her figure poised in the lingering glow of sunset. Lucien noticed at once the faint crease upon her brow, the glint of something urgent in her usually calm eyes. She moved swiftly, pausing only as she reached his side. "There is someone you must meet," she whispered, her voice soft but edged with an urgency he had never heard before. Lucien set aside his quill, heart tightening. "Who?" "Come," was all she said. He followed her through the quiet cloisters, their footsteps muted upon the worn stones. The evening light cast long shadows along the gallery walls, painting their silent passage in hues of amber and grey. They passed beneath the watchful gaze of ancient saints etched in cold stone, figures who bore silent witness to secrets far darker than the abbey's peaceful veneer. At last, Aveline led him beyond the cloisters into a narrow corridor seldom used, one that twisted into the old servants' quarters, long abandoned save for the occasional hidden meeting or whispered exchange. They descended a flight of stone steps, the air growing cool and damp with the scent of earth and moss. In a small chamber at the corridor's end, dimly lit by a single oil lamp, a figure stood waiting. She was cloaked in a rough traveller's mantle, her face half-shadowed beneath a simple hood. Yet as Lucien's eyes adjusted to the gloom, he caught sight of her hands, calloused, stained with traces of herb and earth, a healer's hands. "This is Isolde," Aveline whispered. Lucien stared, his breath catching, the woman from Bézier's. Isolde lifted her gaze, and in her eyes he saw neither fear nor defeat, but a quiet, enduring defiance. The kind born not of rebellion, but of survival. The kind that flickered like a candle held against a storm. "I was told you remember," Isolde said softly, her voice carrying a lilting accent from the southern provinces. "That you keep names, so they do not vanish." Lucien nodded slowly, words caught in his throat. "They tried to silence me," Isolde continued. "They took my home, my family, but they could not take my memory, and they cannot take yours." She stepped closer, drawing something from within her cloak, a slender bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. With a reverent care that mirrored Aveline's own, she placed it into Lucien's hands. He unwrapped it gently. Within lay a small, hand-bound book, its pages filled with delicate script, not in Latin, nor in the formal hand of a scribe, but in the flowing, unguarded letters of one who wrote from the heart. Names, stories, fragments of lives swallowed by the Church's silent decree. "My ledger," Isolde whispered. "I carried it hidden these many years, across villages, through shadows. I wrote what I saw, what I heard, those they accused, those they took. I have no place left to keep it safe, but I was told you would." Lucien felt the weight of it, far greater than its modest size, a tapestry of lives woven by a heart unwilling to forget. His voice came as a breath. "I will protect it, I swear." Isolde's eyes softened, a flicker of gratitude warming her solemn gaze. "Then the memory of the lost is safe, for now." Aveline stepped beside them, her presence a quiet anchor in the gathering dusk. "We are more than scribes now," she whispered. "We are guardians of a story the Church fears will one day be known." Lucien held the two ledgers close to his heart, the one begun by Aveline, the other carried by Isolde through years of silent defiance. And in that moment, beneath the weight of names both remembered and yet to be known, he felt something stir within him, a fragile, potent hope, the power of remembrance. For though the church could command ink, burn scrolls and silence voices, it could not chain the hearts that dared to remember. As night descended upon Saint-Denis, Lucien, Aveline and Isolde remained within the hidden chamber, bound by a quiet fellowship stronger than any vow spoken in the grand halls above. Together, they formed a living testament, a sanctuary of memory guarded by those who refused to forget. And in that silent communion, a flickering ember of resistance caught light, destined, perhaps, to burn brighter than they dared to dream. The night had deepened into a velvet hush by the time Lucien, Aveline and Isolde sat together within the narrow stone chamber hidden beneath the south wing of Saint-Denis Abbey. The single oil lamp flickered in its iron sconce, its glow pressing against the encroaching dark like a fragile heartbeat. The walls, thick with centuries of silent witness, seemed to lean in upon them, their quiet presence wrapping the trio in a cocoon of secrecy and shared purpose. Lucien cradled Isolde's ledger in his hands, his thumb running gently along its weathered spine. The pages within hummed with a strange living weight, a compilation of names, stories and whispered truths penned by a woman who had risked everything to ensure they would not be swallowed by the church's quiet machinery of oblivion. He lifted his gaze to Isolde, studying the lines that hardship had etched upon her face. Though shadows half veiled her features, there was no mistaking the quiet strength that glowed in her eyes. It was not the brittle defiance of the openly rebellious, nor the hardened resolve of the zealot. It was something softer, yet infinitely more enduring. The strength of one who had chosen, day after day, to remember when forgetting would have been far easier. "I kept it hidden beneath my herbs," Isolde said at last, her voice low, edged with a faint rasp born of countless whispered prayers and hurried farewells. "Wrapped beneath yarrow and sage, woven into the lining of my satchel. They searched me often, but they never looked past what they thought they saw." A faint smile touched Aveline's lips, her hands folded gently within the sleeves of her habit. "They seldom do." Lucien felt a quiet warmth stir in his chest, a strange comfort in this shared understanding. "They see only what suits their design," he murmured. "The healer, the scribe, the obedient sister, but never the one who remembers." Isolde inclined her head, a shadowed nod that seemed almost reverent. "They expect silence, they expect fear, and so they never hear the names whispered in the dark." A hush settled over them again, a silence soft and complete, filled not with unease, but with the weight of unspoken truths. The oil lamp hissed faintly, its light casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. Beyond the thick stone the world slept, unaware of the quiet resistance that gathered strength within this small sanctuary of remembrance. At length Isolde spoke once more. "I can carry this no further," she said, her gaze steady upon Lucien. "There are too many eyes, too many shadows that follow me now, but I will not let their names vanish into the dark, not while I still draw breath." Lucien nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the ledger in his hands, far heavier than its modest form would suggest. "We will keep it safe," he said softly, "alongside ours." Isolde's eyes softened. "Then the memory of the lost is safe, for now." Aveline leaned forward, her voice a soft murmur. "And when the time comes, we will not only keep them, we will speak them, loud enough that even the stones cannot help but remember." A faint shadow of a smile touched Isolde's lips, a fleeting flicker of something like hope. That day may yet come. Lucien met Aveline's gaze, seeing in her eyes the same quiet resolve that burned within his own heart. They had been two, a brother and a sister bound by silent duty. Now they were three, and perhaps in time they would be many. But for now their fellowship remained cloaked in shadow and bound by the hush of secrecy. Isolde rose then, gathering her cloak around her slender frame. The lamp's light caught the edge of her face, illuminating the worn lines of a life marked by endurance rather than surrender. She moved with the careful grace of one accustomed to watching every shadow, weighing every silence. "I will leave before first light," she said quietly. "The roads grow dangerous, and I have lingered too long in this region. But there are places where the church's hand is weaker, where voices may still be heard without fear. Lucien felt a tightening in his chest, the strange ache of knowing he might never see her again. "Will you be safe?" Isolde's smile was faint, almost wistful. "I have never been safe, but I have always endured." She stepped toward the doorway, pausing only when Aveline rose to meet her. The two women stood face to face, a moment of silent understanding passing between them. Then, with a soft touch upon Isolde's arm, Aveline whispered, "Go with courage." Isolde inclined her head, her expression softening. "And may you both guard what must not be forgotten." With that, she turned and slipped quietly into the shadows of the corridor beyond, her footsteps fading like a whispered prayer against the stone. Lucien and Aveline stood in the chamber's soft gloom, the two ledgers resting side by side upon the small wooden table, a silent testimony to their shared vow. Lucien reached out, wrapping the ledgers together with a length of cloth. "We must hide them, deeper than before, somewhere even Mathis would never search." Aveline nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I know a place, a chamber beneath the crypt, a hollow sealed by the stones of those long dead. No one dares enter." Lucien met her gaze. "Then we'll guard them together." Her faint smile flickered in the lamplight, touched with sorrow, yet threaded with something stronger. Always. The oil lamp burned low, its flame softening as they worked in quiet unity, wrapping the ledgers in cloth, binding them with a cord, their hands moving in silent accord. Theirs was a ritual not sanctified by the church nor hallowed by tradition, but sacred nonetheless. A covenant born in the silent folds of memory, beneath the shadowed vaults of oblivion. As they ascended the narrow stairway toward the crypt, the first hints of dawn brushed the sky with a pale, uncertain light. A soft wind stirred the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper of Isolde's parting words. "They fear the spoken word even more." Lucien felt those words settle deep within him, a quiet seed taking root. The time would come when the names they guarded would no longer remain hidden in ink nor whispered in secret. The time would come when the truth they carried would be spoken by voices that would rise against the silence. And when that time came, the world would listen. For now, they would wait. For now, they would remember. And in the hush of dawn's first breath, amidst the silent stones of Saint-Denis, the quiet fire of remembrance burned ever brighter, fueled not by rage nor rebellion, but by the enduring faith that even the smallest ember could one day ignite a flame no darkness could smother. The town of Altenburg lay swaddled in the quiet hush of the eastern forests, its rooftops softened by summer's gold, and its people bent beneath the quiet weight of custom and fear. By the time the year of our Lord 1449 had arrived, Altenburg had learned, by whispered warnings and burnt lessons, that the fires of the hunt spared no heart nor hearth. Though time had passed since the last girl was led trembling to the stake at the town square, the embers of terror smouldered still beneath the ash of apparent peace. In the great stone church, its walls thick with centuries of prayers and secrets, Father Anselm moved as a man caught between two worlds. By day, he was the face of solace, the priest whose soft words calmed the agitated and whose hands anointed the sick with quiet reverence. But when dusk descended and the candles burned low within the vestry, another face of the church stirred. There, records were hidden, carefully inked scrolls bundled within leather, marked with seals of quiet authority. Anselm, who had once been a mere servant to the Holy Order, now stood as its silent keeper in Altenburg. The diocese, in its shrouded wisdom, had tasked him with preserving not just the faith of the people, but the delicate balance between memory and forgetting. For what the church had come to fear was not the witches, nor even the hunts, but the unravelling of its carefully woven tapestry of control. The first whispers reached Anselm through a parchment delivered by a travelling friar, damp from the rains and sealed with the crimson cross of the inquisitorial chamber. The words were plain, but heavy in their undertone. The matter of Hildegard of Altenburg is to be treated as concluded. All remnants of record, formal or whispered, are to be expunged with discretion and finality. Her soul rests with God. Hildegard. The name sent a soft ripple through the priest's memory. She had been the last. The quiet girl with eyes too wide for this world, accused not by proof but by fear, fermented in idle minds. She had been burned, Her ashes mixed with the earth of the marketplace, where the townsfolk now sold bread as though no screams had ever touched those stones. Anselm's hands folded the letter slowly, pressing its creases with a care that belied its quiet violence. The church did not merely wish the matter forgotten, it willed it erased. The silent hand that swept away the footprints before anyone could follow. The next days brought him into a strange pattern of half-lit errands. By early morning, he visited the scribe's house under the pretense of blessing his newborn son, but his eyes fell as if in passing upon the ledgers where village occurrences were recorded. With gentle questions veiled in casual talk, he learned that Hildegard's name still sat, inked in black, upon a list of parish deaths. That evening, the ledger vanished from the scribe's shelf, borrowed for ecclesiastical review, and returned the next morning, its page carefully rewritten in the scribe's own hand, but the girl's name absent as though she had never drawn breath. From the church's own records, Anselm unbound the register of sacraments. With the solemn patience of a monk, he pried away the page where Hildegard's baptism had been entered, replacing it with a carefully inked copy that omitted her entirely. The seam was near seamless, unless one knew precisely what to look for, and none in Altenburg would. At night, by the flickering light of the vestry lamp, he read through accounts of those who had testified at Hildegard's trial. He noted their names, carefully, meticulously, and by discreet inquiry, learned who among them still spoke of the affair. For the few who did, quiet reminders of confession and the weight of sin sufficed. For others, a subtler approach, a friar sent with gifts of indulgence, or a whispered word in a merchant's ear that certain tongues might invite scrutiny from authorities beyond Altenburg's borders. Slowly, surely, the town forgot, not by force, but by the slow erosion of shared memory, gently steered by an unseen hand. But memory, Anselm knew, was a root with many threads, and some, no matter how deeply buried, clawed their way back to the surface. One such root came in the form of Greta, the washerwoman's daughter. Barely 15, she bore the look of those who dream too vividly and speak too freely. It was said she wandered the woods at dusk, and once, when the town's river ran thick with silt after a storm, she had whispered words that seemed to draw clear water from the mire. The whispers reached Anselm not through rumour but from the lips of Brother Matthias, his novice, a boy too earnest for discretion, yet too observant to be dismissed. "She reminds them of Hildegard," Matthias said, his voice a low murmur within the chapel's shadowed alcove. "The baker's wife said it last eve, that she's strange." Anselm's heart, usually calm as a chapel bell, gave a muted thud. He had worked too long, too carefully, to allow the embers of accusation to kindle again. The death of one girl had nearly frayed the entire weave. Another would undo it entirely. He found Greta at the river's edge on a cool morning, the mist clinging low over the water. She was humming, a soft, lilting tune that spoke more of longing than magic. Her hands swirled in the shallows, gathering water into a clay pot. "Child," Anselm said softly, approaching like a shadow between the trees. She startled, nearly tipping the pot, but his smile was warm, his eyes kind. "You have a voice that could calm the morning birds." She looked at him, wary, her young face too knowing for its years. "Father," she murmured, a touch of suspicion in her tone. Anselm crouched beside her, dipping his hand into the water. It ran clear now, the storm's muck long since gone. "You know," he said gently, "sometimes people see what they fear, even when it is not there. And sometimes a word, even a harmless one, can stir shadows that have long slumbered." Greta studied him, her hands tightening on the clay pot. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," Anselm said, his voice soft as the river's flow. "But others may not. You are young. You have a life ahead. Best you let some things remain within." She nodded slowly, a small reluctant gesture, but the look in her eyes lingered, a look not of guilt, but of something deeper, a quiet understanding. Anselm left her there, the words spoken between them sinking like stones beneath the water's surface. In that silent agreement, a thread of memory was preserved, unseen by all but two souls. As he walked back to the town, the sun rising in soft gold over the tiled roofs, Anselm felt the weight of the church's unseen hand pressing once more upon his shoulder. The cover-up was not a single act, nor a silent decree. It was a living thing, a quiet war against the very nature of remembrance. And so, in Altenburg, The church's shadow continued its silent labour, not to deny the past, but to carefully, relentlessly guide how it was remembered or forgotten. The summer deepened over Altenburg, and with it came a quieting of the whispers that had once threatened to stir the embers of fear. Greta's name, though still mentioned now and again by idle tongues, became less and less a subject of suspicion. The townsfolk, guided by gentle nods and casual remarks from those whom Father Anselm had quietly counselled, began to see in her not the shadow of Hildegard, but simply a child of the village. Young, perhaps odd in her ways, but harmless. Anselm watched the shift with a practised eye. He knew the subtle art of steering hearts was not unlike tending a garden. A word here, a silence there, and soon the vines of rumour withered before they could bear poisonous fruit. Yet within him stirred a faint ache, a whisper of unease that no careful pruning could erase. For every rumour stilled, for every memory gently excised, a part of the truth withered also, and he wondered if, in the quiet march of forgetting, they were losing more than the dangers they sought to avoid. One evening, as the sky lay wrapped in the soft hues of dusk, Anselm found himself summoned to the bishop's manor, a low, grey building that sat at the edge of Altenburg's northern rise, its stones older than the memory of any living soul. The summons had come in the form of a folded note, sealed in wax of deepest green, carried by a pale young acolyte who spoke no words but bowed deeply before departing. When Anselm arrived, he was greeted not by the bishop himself, but by Brother Severin, a man whose presence had always carried the subtle chill of a winter wind. Severin's eyes, pale as misted glass, met Anselm's with a look that offered no warmth, only calculation. "The bishop desires your report," Severin said, his voice low, each word precise. "On the matter of the Altenburg incident, and its lingering echoes." Anselm inclined his head. "The matter is quiet. The townsfolk speak no more of Hildegard. Greta, too, has been counselled." Severin gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good. The church has little patience for echoes of dangerous tales. You understand, of course, the gravity of allowing such matters to fester." "I do," Anselm replied, his voice steady. For a long moment, Severin studied him in silence, then turned toward a high-backed chair set before the hearth. Upon its arm rested a ledger, bound in dark leather, its pages thick and lined with meticulous script. Severin lifted it carefully, opening to a page marked with a red ribbon. "There are those," Severin began, tracing a long finger down the neat columns of names, "who believe the work of remembrance is a burden carried only by men of faith, that by guiding memory we preserve peace." His eyes lifted, meeting Anselm's. "But peace is fragile, Father, as is loyalty. There are rumours of dissent, of those within the town, within the church, who question our methods." Anselm felt a chill that reached beyond the walls of the bishop's manor. "Do you suspect—" "I suspect nothing," Severin replied calmly, "but vigilance is the handmaiden of wisdom. We must know who speaks and what is said, and you, Father Anselm, are the ears of the church in Altenburg." The weight of the words settled over him like a shroud. He had known, of course, the nature of his role, knew that the quiet manipulations, the erasures, the soft silencing of dangerous tongues were part of a larger tapestry. But now, the task was laid bare with chilling clarity. He was not merely the shepherd of peace, he was its sentinel and its warden. Severin closed the ledger with a soft thud, his gaze unwavering. "We trust you, Father. See that our trust is not misplaced." The interview ended without further word, and Anselm walked back through the twilight streets, the sounds of the village soft around him, the murmur of families at supper, the faint laughter of children at play. He moved among them like a shadow, unseen yet watching, his heart heavy with a burden that had shifted subtly, darkly. In the days that followed, his vigilance took on a new sharpness. Where once he had sought merely to guide and counsel, now he watched with an edge of quiet suspicion. He listened more closely to the words exchanged in the market, noted the glances between neighbours, the silences that stretched too long in casual conversation. And in this careful observation, he began to notice a thread he had not seen before. It was not Greta who drew quiet stares now, nor the echoes of Hildegard's name. It was whispers of the church itself, soft, hesitant questions asked in corners where ears were believed absent. "I wonder," said a blacksmith's apprentice one morning, leaning too close to a brewer's son, "if the church forgets too much for us." A seamstress, her needle paused in mid-stitch, murmured over tea to a friend, "It's strange how things simply vanish." They were words said softly, with nervous glances, half in jest and half in fear. But they were words nonetheless, seeds of doubt drifting on the unseen wind. Anselm felt their weight, heavier than the rumours of witches or the superstitions of old. For these were not born of fear, but of quiet awareness, an awakening of the very memory the church had sought to soften and guide. He pondered this, late into the night, seated before the dim glow of a solitary candle in the vestry. Was it possible, he wondered, that in seeking to erase the scars of the past, they had instead drawn attention to the hand that wielded the cloth? Had the work of quiet forgetting become a shadow that stirred the mind instead of silencing it? The question lay upon his heart like a silent bell, its echoes soft but insistent. And then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a new missive arrived. Delivered not by a known hand, but slipped quietly beneath the door of the church, a single sheet of vellum, its edges trimmed with a precision that spoke of careful craft. Upon it, in a hand unfamiliar yet precise, were words that struck a chord deeper than any command from bishop or inquisitor. What is forgotten by men lingers in the eyes of God. No seal marked it, no signature claimed its ink. But as Anselm read and reread the words, a slow, creeping certainty took hold. Someone watched. Someone within Altenburg or beyond had seen the quiet work of the church's hand, and now reached out, not with accusation, but with a subtle warning. For the first time since the ashes of Hildegard had been scattered to the wind, Father Anselm felt the stirrings of a fear he could not quiet with words, nor smother with silence. The unseen hand had begun to tremble. The summer waned, and a faint breath of autumn stirred through the cloistered streets of Altenburg. The harvest moon swelled each night, casting its pale light upon rooftops and riverbanks, where shadows lingered long after the sun had fallen. And within the stone walls of the church, Father Anselm moved like a man haunted, not by spectres of guilt nor the silent echoes of the past, but by the soft presence of a watcher unseen. The note that had appeared beneath his door had not been a singular occurrence. In the weeks that followed, others came, always by unseen hand, always left where none could say who placed them. Sometimes slipped within the pages of a hymn book, once folded inside the cover of a ledger he himself had set down mere moments before. Each bore a different hand, yet the words sang the same haunting refrain. What is hidden by men is revealed by time. Silence is a veil, but even veils are lifted. Ashes do not vanish, they wait. Each phrase whispered of a knowledge both profound and chilling, a knowing that stretched beyond mere rumour. And unlike the idle talk of the villagers, these words carried no accusation, no threat, only a patient, inevitable certainty, as though they were not warnings at all, but simple statements of truth waiting to unfold. Anselm pondered each message with a heart caught between dread and something stranger still, a faint, reluctant awe. For who could craft such words? Who dared to speak so near to the heart of the church's hidden labour, yet remain untouched by its shadow? He scoured the town's faces in silent study, watched the tanner as he worked, the seamstress at her loom, the merchants plying their trade. He listened for a voice, a glance, a slip of the tongue. But the village flowed on in its quiet rhythm, unchanged on the surface, a painting of peace beneath which currents stirred unseen. Brother Matthias, ever eager to aid his mentor, noted the unease that settled upon the priest's brow. "Father," the boy ventured one morning as they prepared the altar, "is there trouble?" Anselm looked at him, so young still, his eyes bright with the fierce light of faith untested by shadows. For a moment, the priest considered sharing a fragment of his burden. But the words caught in his throat, for what could he say? That the church's quiet hand was no longer the sole weaver of memory? That some silent voice whispered from the shadows beyond even their reach? Instead, Anselm placed a hand upon the boy's shoulder, giving it a firm fatherly squeeze. "No trouble, Matthias. Only the weight of care for those we serve." Matthias nodded, accepting the answer with the trust of youth. Yet in the depths of Anselm's heart stirred a growing awareness that perhaps the boy himself might one day hear whispers that no hand could quiet. The days passed, and with them came a subtle shift in the air of Altenburg. The talk of witches, once a silent undercurrent, fell away entirely. The townsfolk spoke not of Hildegard, nor of Greta, nor of anything that might trouble the smooth surface of their lives. And yet Anselm sensed it, not the presence of fear, but of waiting, as if the town itself held its breath. It was Greta who brought the next sign. She came to him one twilight, her figure a slender shadow at the door of the vestry. Her eyes, wide and steady, met his with a quiet resolve that belied her years. "I found this," she said softly, extending a folded parchment. Anselm took it with careful hands. The paper was of fine make, finer than any Greta might possess, its ink a deep, unfading black. He unfolded it slowly, his heart tightening as he read the single line within. "Not all fires are kindled by mortal hands." He looked up, meeting Greta's gaze. "Where did you find this?" She hesitated. "On the steps of the chapel, at dawn." Anselm's thoughts turned swiftly. The steps of the chapel where townsfolk passed each day, where his own feet fell every morning. To leave a message there was bold, or it was something else entirely. "Did anyone see you take it?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I don't think so, but I thought you should know." A long silence stretched between them. At last, Anselm folded the parchment carefully, slipping it into the sleeve of his robe. He placed a hand upon Greta's shoulder, light but firm. "You did well," he said softly, "but you must speak of this to no one. Do you understand?" She nodded, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. When she had gone, Anselm sat long within the vestry, the flickering candle casting soft shadows against the ancient stone. He held the note before him, studying its shape, its ink, its subtle weight. It was not fear alone that stirred within him now. It was a growing certainty that the hand which penned these words moved beyond the veil of earthly power. The Church, for all its reach, worked through men, fallible, cautious, bound by the limits of flesh and time. But this spoke of something else. A watcher unbound by such constraints, a presence that lingered where men believed they alone held dominion. The thought struck a chord deep within the old priest, a hum of unease and a strange, reverent dread. For the first time, the quiet voice within him asked not, "Who watches the Church?" but "What watches the Church?" The final missive came on the eve of the harvest festival. Anselm found it upon the altar itself, resting atop the open book of hours, its placement so deliberate, so impossibly silent in its arrival that his heart nearly faltered at the sight. This time there was no cryptic phrase, no veiled warning. It bore a single word, one that rang within him with the weight of prophecy: remember. He read it once, twice, a third time, each silent reading louder than the last within the chambers of his heart. And in that word he heard not a threat, nor a rebuke, but a command, gentle, patient, inescapable. The act of forgetting, he realized, was a burden too great for any hand, be it priest or bishop, man or institution. Some truths, however dark, were not meant to be buried beneath silence. They endured, not in whispers nor in ink, but in the quiet, relentless heart of time itself. And in that moment, beneath the silent gaze of the chapel's high window where the fading sun cast its last golden rays, Father Anselm felt the weight of his years lift, and a new weight settle in its place. Not the burden of the Church's unseen hand, but the solemn, sacred charge of remembrance. The morning after the harvest festival dawned with a sky softened by the pale hush of autumn mists. The bells of Altenburg rang softly, their notes folding into the morning air like whispered hymns. The village stirred, the streets alive with the slow hum of returning life. Merchants arranging their wares, children chasing the last leaves of summer as they danced upon the wind. Yet amidst this quiet renewal, Father Anselm moved through the heart of Altenburg with a stillness unlike any before. He walked alone, robes drawn close against the morning chill, eyes set not upon the faces of those he passed, but upon something beyond their sight, a truth that hovered just at the edge of understanding. The parchment bearing the single word, "Remember," remained folded within his breast, its weight a quiet thrum against his heart. At first, he had thought to share its message with the bishop. To carry it, as he had carried so many hidden things, into the circle of those who wielded the Church's silent authority. But as dawn unfurled over Altenburg, Anselm knew with a certainty that the message was not meant for them. It was meant for him, and for those like him who stood at the quiet crossroads between faith and fear, between memory and forgetting. He turned toward the marketplace, the very ground where, years before, Hildegard had met her fate beneath a sky thick with the acrid breath of burning wood. The square lay hushed beneath the morning's veil, its stones worn smooth by countless feet, its shadows long and soft beneath the rising sun. There, standing near the old fountain, stood Greta. She turned as he approached, her eyes meeting his with a quiet expectation. There was no fear within them now, no trace of the nervous glances of a child wary of suspicion. What lived behind her gaze was something else entirely, an understanding far older than her years. "I knew you'd come," she said softly, her voice a hush within the morning's peace. Anselm inclined his head, folding his hands before him. "I suppose, so did I." They stood in silence for a long moment, the soft murmur of the town rising faint around them. Then Greta reached into the satchel that hung at her side and withdrew a folded parchment, not fine vellum nor marked with the bold ink of previous messages, but a simple piece of rough-spun paper, its edges uneven, its script unevenly pressed by a trembling hand. "This was left at our door this morning," she whispered. "It wasn't meant for me, but I think you should see it." Anselm took the paper gently, unfolding it with careful hands. The words within were few, their lines etched with a fragile hand that trembled in places yet held its form. "There is no forgetting, there is only silence, and those who dare break it." Beneath the words lay no name, no signature, no seal. He read them twice, then once more, before folding the paper carefully, his heart settling with a strange, unexpected calm. "What do you think it means?" Greta asked, her voice almost a breath. Anselm met her eyes, his own gaze steady, a quiet resolve firming within him. "I think it means that silence is a choice, one that can be unmade." He saw the faintest smile touch the corners of Greta's lips, a smile not of triumph nor relief, but of quiet recognition. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said softly. He gave a slow nod, the truth of her words settling over him like a benediction. "Nor am I." That evening, as the sun dipped low beyond the wooded hills, Father Anselm ascended the pulpit of Altenburg Stone Church. The congregation sat before him, their faces turned in quiet expectation, the hush of the chapel deep and reverent. He spoke, not with the familiar tones of gentle sermons nor the carefully measured words of doctrine, but with the simple, unwavering truth of remembrance. He spoke of Hildegard, not as a shadow, not as a sin to be erased, but as a soul, a daughter of their village, whose memory belonged not beneath the veil of silence, but within the living heart of Altenburg's story. He spoke of fear, the kind that blinds, that silences, that drives men to cruelty, and of the quiet, relentless courage of those who dare to remember, even when the world bids them forget. And as his voice filled the stone chamber, a strange, soft stillness settled upon the people gathered there. Some lowered their heads, others lifted their eyes. Tears welled in eyes that had long remained dry, and in that sacred hush a ripple stirred, soft as the first breath of wind upon a still lake. When his words faded into silence, no one spoke. They simply sat, breathing as one, bound by something deeper than fear or habit, a shared, unspoken understanding. The church's hand would not move against them. There would be no inquiry, no silent corrections, no quiet disappearances, for memory once spoken aloud cannot be unspoken. And in that moment, in the heart of Altenburg, the quiet labour of centuries was undone not by rebellion, nor by force, but by the simple act of truth remembered. Father Anselm stepped down from the pulpit, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Greta met his gaze from the front pew, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and in her smile he saw a future not shaped by silent hands, but by voices raised in quiet courage. That night, as the stars unfurled their quiet tapestry across the darkened sky, Altenburg slept, not beneath a shroud of fear, but beneath the soft, steady hum of a village that remembered. And in a silent chamber beyond the sight of men, a hand that had once moved unseen folded a final parchment, sealing it with a simple mark, a mark not of warning nor of threat, but of peace. For the watchers had seen, and they too remembered.